Good evening, dear viewers. It is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to the next Goldversorg webinar titled War for Gold. After our numerous webinars in 2025, this is now the first webinar in the new year 2026. My name is Jepan Pilic and I will be moderating you through today's live event. It's great to have you with us again. Today's webinar is titled War for Gold. It contains two key words. The first is war. Germany has now become the largest military donor in Western and Central Europe and plays a central role within NATO in terms of rearmament. While tanks, missiles, and military structures are being funded, the same billions are missing from pensions, healthcare, infrastructure, and the protection of your personal wealth. And all this is happening at a time when the German economy has been in its longest stagnation in decades. When the state continues to channel more and more money into armament despite ongoing crises, it is sending a very clear message. Security and power are being prioritized over the financial protection of its own citizens. At the same time, major powers are securing the resources of the future, for example, in Ukraine, in Venezuela, in Greenland, everywhere that energy, rare resources, and strategic control are at stake. In this global resource poker game, there are always winners and, on the other side, losers. The population has virtually no influence over these decisions, but still, each individual can decide whether to remain a passive spectator or to deliberately take the side of the winners and protect their wealth before others decide what happens to it. And that brings us to the second keyword, gold. Gold, and in a broader sense, silver as well, are physical assets that cannot be printed, frozen, or devalued with a mouse click. In an environment of war, rearmament, mountains of debt, and economic weakness, precious metals are turning from an old relic back into a personal financial weapon. As a substitute for money, as a shield against inflation, currency crises, and political interference. The central question is, do you want to sit back and watch others decide over your assets, or do you want to take action? Do you want to hold assets that have proven themselves in crises like these for centuries? So the overall result of this development is clear. States prioritize power, rearmament, securing resources, but not the protection of private wealth of the population. Those who leave their wealth to the system make themselves dependent on political decisions, debt policies, and the course of crises. Physical precious metals are therefore not speculation, but a conscious safeguard outside of this financial system. The real question, therefore, is not how the wars will develop or how the balance of power will shift or how political systems will be structured. No, because you cannot influence that, dear viewers. The question is whether your wealth is positioned in such a way that it can survive all these developments. And for this question, I am about to welcome our first top-tier expert who always has the best answers on the topic of wealth protection and real security. Mr. Christian Trinker. He's an expert in secure wealth management and high-security storage. Good evening. So, Mr. Trinker. Yes, indeed.
Yes, wonderful. A very beautiful good evening to you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. At the very beginning, I would like to send my warmest greetings out into the wide world. From here in Vienna to North and South America, Africa, Australia, India, everywhere our clients feel at home at the moment. And right after that truly wonderful and warm introduction by Stefan, I really want to give each and every one of you a very positive and encouraging message before I even get started with my talk today. There is a very common thread that can definitely help you in your journey. And actually, when you look closely, it is a beautiful golden thread. And by that, of course, I mean gold. Because in the end, gold is always the most stable and reliable financial lifeline. No matter which specific war or conflict we are talking about right now, gold remains the ultimate essential lifeline for every single person who truly understands its value. And you, dear viewers, do you know what I mean? Because you understand this, since gold has led you to us. And for that, I want to sincerely congratulate you. You have done the right thing When I say gold, of course, silver is always included as well. We all know that anyway. Especially in the last few weeks, this has become even clearer. So today is about this and how everything is changing in that direction. War doesn't just take place on the battlefield, but can also happen in many other ways. And what we are currently experiencing is a structural shift in the global order. The assumptions that were taken for granted for many decades are now losing more and more of their significance. That's something you really have to think through. For a long time, free global trade was based on very important foundations and basic rules. Trade routes are secure. Property is respected, contracts are honored, and all of this completely independent of power relations. But what am I actually talking about right now? I'm talking about how the international foundation of trust, which I just mentioned, is starting to falter. And here's a concrete example. Let's start as an introduction with the example of Venezuela, and in this case, the policies of Donald Trump's administration. Just in December, a few weeks ago, there were incidents at sea around Venezuela. You more or less followed all of this in the news, at least the things that were allowed to be shown. A lot certainly wasn't shown, but what was shown was dramatic. How ships were stopped, inspected, and in some cases even shot down from the air. Of course, there's always the official story with these things. Officially, it was about enforcing existing measures about supposed drug boats. We're all in agreement on that. It's a script that's used over and over again, stopping drug smuggling. No one has a problem with that. But in the same way, they also went after Panama using the same playbook. Many years ago, of course, the older listeners among you might still remember General Noriega and all the stories that happened back then. But in fact, back then, as well as today, the Americans are once again concerned with controlling trade routes. And in January, the next step followed right away. So that was just a few days ago, you could say, about 3 weeks ago. Tankers carrying Venezuelan oil were redirected on the open sea. This was also reported on dramatically. And the cargo was then taken over by the Americans. At the same time, they detained the president of Nicaragua, Nicolas Maduro. You could say he was kidnapped. Regardless of any political assessment, regardless of how you want to interpret it, the signal sent by the whole affair is clear. Power is no longer just being threatened, it is being exercised. And while we in Europe are still debating the legal niceties, Mr. Trump is taking advantage of the situation. He strikes. Resources are being redistributed, payment flows are being redirected, ownership is being redefined. The American president has never concealed this course of action. He says it more or less straight out. He openly states that strategic resources should serve American interests without any diplomatic packaging. This is no longer classic trade policy, but rather open power politics. And with that, we are once again moving into a world where the strongest ship sets the course. And what works once, dear viewers, will certainly not remain an isolated case. Of course, this will lead to further events. The year is still young, and Venezuela is just one example of this development. Because the country has the largest confirmed oil reserves in the world, complemented by gold, silver, gas, and other strategic raw material. But nevertheless, today it hardly plays a stabilizing role in the energy market because, of course, political instability, sanctions, and political interference have thrown everything into disarray. And over the years, Venezuela's oil industry was really structurally destroyed. The state oil company, of course, was deeply affected. It was directed by politics, investments were lacking, there was a massive exodus of skilled workers, and the infrastructure crumbled. Production volumes naturally shrank as well, and American sanctions contributed further to Venezuela's decline. But with Donald Trump's return to the White House, the whole situation has intensified even further. And US energy policy is aimed at strategically influencing global oil flows. And that's the core of the whole story. Venezuela is not coming into focus as a market participant, but rather as a lever. Because if oil from Venezuela is extracted and marketed by the Americans in the future, OPEC will be in trouble. And the cartel will then lose the significance it still has today. At least that's the plan behind it, in my opinion. Of course, you can look at this from two different perspectives. You could also say that Maduro has stayed in power through election fraud, and hardly anyone is going to miss him anyway. That's the flip side of the whole thing. And you could say, well, maybe it was the right thing to do anyway. But still, this case is setting a precedent. And the case of Venezuela shows a fundamental shift in the commodities market. Oil is no longer just a neutral market, but is also being used politically. Sanctions, blockades, and all that influence the price of supply and demand more than the classic market mechanisms did in the past. Venezuela can't stabilize the oil market in the short term. There's just too much to deal with. It's too decayed and broken. A lot of investment is needed there. But in the long run, this situation will increase uncertainty throughout the entire energy sector. That's exactly where gold comes back into focus. Gold has substance. It is beyond the reach of political intervention, especially if you hold it physically. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why demand is rising right now. Very strongly among investors, but also among central banks, all of whom are increasing their gold reserves to reduce their dependencies. Gold is, so to speak, the insurance element against political and systemic risks. For us in Europe, what does that mean? We are living in a time of reorganization, dear viewers. Rules are changing. Power dynamics are shifting. And as a result, gold is gaining tremendous importance. Physical gold and silver are a steady anchor, provided that it is true ownership, clearly stored, and ideally kept outside the banking system. Those are the most important prerequisites. And the events surrounding Venezuela are not an isolated case, but rather a textbook example.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Trinker. As you can see, dear viewers, our experts are already on fire today and are jumping right into the first topics. Venezuela, a major flashpoint in recent weeks and months. There has certainly been a lot said about it. We will come back to Venezuela and touch on a second topic here. Before we continue with this topic, let me also welcome our two other experts. The next one is the head of wholesale at Goldversorger and a recognized expert in market analysis. Hardly anyone knows the precious metals market as well as he does. In our webinars, he regularly excites our viewers with his insider knowledge, which is usually only heard behind the scenes. Mr. Draguljevic, good evening. Please turn on the sound for Mr. Draguljevic so we can hear him clearly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan, for the kind introduction. Good evening, dear viewers, to all of you out there. We could hardly wait to hold today's webinar. You can see it with Chris. He jumped right in with the first topic and didn't even let Stefan finish speaking. But that's exactly how it should continue. A lot is happening in the market. It's very turbulent, and we have some very exciting topics lined up again. And that's why I'm all the more pleased, especially with the prices we're currently seeing. So sit back and enjoy today's webinar.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we're not wasting any time. We have numerous topics to discuss. That's why we covered the most important things right at the beginning. But to conclude the introduction round, I have a completely new face for you. Specially flown in from beautiful Switzerland, Mr. Carlo de Prete, Customer Account Manager at Goldversorger. We now have a new branch near Zurich, which he manages. There he looks after international major clients and provides fascinating insights into the advantages Switzerland offers as a financial center, far beyond its famous ski resorts. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Greetings to everyone and gruezi, as they say in Zurich. And thank you very much, Stefan, for the introduction. Hello, Nicola. Hello, Christian.
Yes, we'll be hearing from each other again later. And yes, I would say let's continue right away. Perhaps for our many new viewers whom I can see joining us today, a few notes about our webinar. Throughout the entire webinar, our private chat function is open for you. There, you can send your questions to us directly at any time. You can find it at the top right of your screen. And these questions will then be personally addressed by me to our 3 experts at the very end. And they will try to answer each question individually for you so that you can get the maximum benefit from this live event. And at the end, we will also have, or rather it's open at any time, the gold hotline, which you can always see at the very bottom of the screen. The phone number, you can call at any time and our team is available for you. Yes, here it is again, large on the screen. Orders, setting up storage, or if you would like a detailed consultation, feel free to use the hotline. We look forward to your call. And as previously mentioned, we already discussed the first topic about Venezuela with Mr. Trinker. That's why I'm bringing Mr. Trinker back again. I have another question about that. The thing is, in Venezuela, a lot has happened in the last decade in general. A lot has happened. There was also a story about a huge amount of gold suddenly disappearing, Mr. Trinker. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I already thought you were going to ask me if we found the amber room. No, of course not. But I'm reporting on a completely different, enormous treasure. And it actually comes from Venezuela. And here the dots connect in an exciting way. Today, I already asked our insider from Switzerland, Carlo, if he knows anything more about it, because there is a lead. The lead points to Switzerland, of course, as so often, and it's a huge treasure. And I want to talk a bit about it because while the whole world is always distracted and has been distracted by all sorts of headlines about elections and crises and more crises, that's just how it is. We are all constantly unsettled so that we don't look where things are really happening, but instead look where we're supposed to. But at that time, and this was already a few years ago, one of the biggest financial thrillers of modern history unfolded quietly and secretly, you have to say. Open-ended, we still have no idea what else might come out of this. At the center is this man with the big mustache, who is now in prison in New York, Mr. Maduro, and the former, until recently, president of Venezuela, or at least he clung to the presidential seat, even though apparently he hadn't actually won the last elections. But as I said, today he is in a New York prison. Maybe he knows something about it, but he probably won't tell us. So at the center is Mr. Maduro and a treasure of gold whose disappearance may forever remain a mystery. What I'm about to show you is not a local problem of Venezuela, but rather it's actually the end of unconditional trust in paper assets. And perhaps the first tremor of a new era, if one wants to put it in such grandiose terms, the new era in which gold regains its importance. It will become the hardest currency in geopolitics. What do I mean by that? Starting from the year 2012 and continuing through 2016, while remaining almost entirely unnoticed and under the radar of the general global public, a massive total of 127,000 kilograms. So 127 tons of gold disappeared from Venezuela to Switzerland on several flights. Officially, it was declared as refining, but the reality is much more complicated. We're talking about a fortune that was already worth several billion euros at the time. And with today's gold prices, it's almost astronomical, but anyone can do the math. And in fact, it has evaporated in the fog of global non-transparency. The Swiss customs statistics confirm the arrival of the gold in Switzerland. As meticulously as only a good bureaucracy can do, everything is carefully recorded. But then every trace is lost in the entire machinery. And at a time when everything around is already crumbling, the power of OPEC is crumbling. And there is the America First economic order that is being imposed on us. In this context, this gold is no longer just a simple reserve, but actually the ultimate insurance against political arbitrariness. At least that was probably Mr. Maduro's plan, unless one wants to assume something even more sinister of him. The system of neutralization in Swiss refineries, however, that's also interesting. That's the key here. There, the gold from Venezuela is melted down. These 127 tons, 127,000 kilograms of gold, until its origin is completely concealed. And all of this has already happened. It was an identity change at the heart of Europe. The news agencies are still arguing about it, whether it might even be more, but the real explosiveness behind it probably lies in what is called distress selling. So it is suspected that this was a sale made under pressure. Venezuela apparently sold off its family silver, or rather turned its silver into cash, though it's already silver, in order to survive even back then. And then the gold went from London to Turkey, and it ended up somewhere else. Nobody knows where. It will probably never come to light again. But what's also very interesting about this story is whoever controls the refineries, the gold refineries, controls the truth about the wealth of nations today. That's an interesting thought. This isn't just simple mismanagement. It's a harbinger of a truly new era. We're entering, well, we already are in a way. With one foot at least, we're already in a new world order. And this is a world where currencies are used as weapons. And gold is the only escape route. The missing gold from Venezuela, it could be anywhere today. It could be sitting in Asian vaults, or maybe split up in private portfolios. I don't think it's at Carlo's house, though. He's not that much of an insider, but maybe he does know a thing or two about where it went. A lead. I'll ask him again about it. But as far as Western sanctions are concerned, it's definitely out of reach. And when a state loses control over its gold, it loses its sovereignty. That's something that needs to be said as well. So the example of Venezuela is a warning to every central banker. In a world of crumbling alliances, physical traceability becomes a matter of survival. Gold is never just a commodity. It is the final word in every geopolitical dispute. Have you understood what this story is really about? When trust is gone, all that remains is what you can touch. The example of Venezuela shows us today, gold is the only trust you can actually touch. In a world without clear rules and with alliances crumbling all around, traceability becomes a matter of survival for everyone. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new reality. Gold is never just a commodity. It is the final word in every geopolitical dispute. And there are still many disputes that haven't even been settled yet. Thank you, Stefan. I'll hand it back over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the explanation and for wrapping up the topic on Venezuela. I believe the shift in power there is already changing a great many things worldwide. And I think China is watching this very closely as well. How did Beijing react to the recent events, Mr. Draguljevic?
First of all, thank you, Christian, for the current insights into the Venezuela issue. Here you can really see clearly that whoever holds the power ultimately decides who owns the gold, or in fact, who owns the raw materials as well. So that's something that really needs to be emphasized. And don't worry, we're not going to get into a long fundamental discussion about Venezuela today, even though there's much more to talk about on this topic. This time we're using the case much more to understand the broader geopolitical dynamics currently at play in the market. So it's not about Venezuela in detail, but rather about the way in which geopolitical tensions are occurring more frequently today and how markets, currencies, and international relations are being influenced. And as Stefan already mentioned, China. For many years, China has tried to secure geopolitical influence through economic means. Loans, infrastructure projects, and long-term oil agreements were all intended to provide that security, to stabilize the country, and also the political influence between the states. And likewise, China wanted to make itself increasingly independent from the United States through its good relationship with resource-rich Venezuela. In theory, it's actually a very clever, rational model. In practice, however, as I mentioned earlier, the one who holds the power decides, because nowadays economic relationships offer more reliable protection against political ruptures. In this case, which was already mentioned before, the intervention of the USA. This intervention essentially nullified all of China's efforts. That means China is basically left with nothing. And despite massive financial involvement, even a great power like China cannot control political escalations, shifts in power, or military dynamics. And what's crucial here is not who is economically stronger, but how quickly these supposedly stable political situations can tip over. And as a result, this can, of course, lead to further tensions between major powers, perhaps even between China and the USA. And it is precisely this dynamic that is extremely important for capital markets. Many investors are asking themselves just how stable the underlying power and currency systems really are. Because currencies play a very important role here, they are directly affected by such scenarios since they are tied to states and political conditions. In a world of growing tensions as we are currently seeing and experiencing, this systematically increases the risk associated with paper currencies, regardless of whether we're talking about the dollar, the euro, or other currencies. And it is precisely at this point that gold becomes extremely relevant, because gold operates independently of all this state instability or any other agreements made between countries. Over the years, it stands outside the geopolitical sphere of influence and outside of national interest or even conflicts of interest. And that's why the crucial insight from such geopolitical cases is not that gold is positioned against certain currencies or countries, but that it operates independently of the currency system itself. And for example, China recognized this in time and also increased its reserves accordingly. And that's why they are still massively increasing their reserves today.
Yes, thank you very much for the explanation. That's also very important. China and their response. The geopolitical dynamics are increasing, they're intensifying. Where is the next conflict looming, Mr. Trinker?
That's an interesting question. 3 days ago, I would have said Greenland, but maybe we'll get to that later. Because here we want to try to weave a bit of a connection between the USA, Venezuela, and China. Now, I could also bring Taiwan into the mix, the semiconductor industry, and the oil tankers that are being held up. These are the main characters in a thriller that's currently unfolding. At this point, can we talk in general about the constellation and broaden our perspective a bit? It's actually not easy because we only want to throw around buzzwords and talk in broad terms. But so far, we haven't really covered Venezuela. That's why we've mentioned it so often, not because we want to do an analysis of Venezuela, but because it actually serves as an example. It's the best example to make a much larger geopolitical, in other words, global political development visible, one that's unfolding right now, right before our eyes, like in a crazy movie. It's no longer about Venezuela itself, but about the way power, the economy, and politics are now completely intertwined. So if we want to understand the dynamics, we can't avoid looking at China anyway. China is at the center of this whole story, alongside the USA, of course. And unlike the USA, which has many military bases around the world, China has taken a different approach. Over many years, China has very deliberately built economic relationships with resource-rich countries in Africa and Asia, always following the same pattern, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. They provide these countries with better infrastructure, jobs, and so on, but of course, they also make these countries dependent. It should be said, though, that the World Bank has actually done exactly the same things for the West, just as brutally or even more brutally. But now back to China. They have, of course, also acted deliberately. They have built economic relationships with Venezuela. And these relationships, the basis for them was loans that Venezuela received from the Chinese, of course, infrastructure projects and technical cooperation that the Chinese offered to the Venezuelans. Naturally, not in connection with Venezuela's currency. Nobody cares about that, but with Venezuela's real currency. And those are long-term supply agreements in the oil sector. And now, dear listeners, a circle is already starting to close. The underlying model is quite clear. Economic intervention brings stability, and it secures long-term access to the strategic resources that China urgently needs, of course. But in recent years, it has become apparent that economic entanglement alone is no longer sufficient to steer these global political developments. Even an economically powerful country like China cannot prevent the situation from escalating, and that other major powers, well, you know who, take advantage of these opportunities to realign their influence. And that's exactly what happened before our eyes in Venezuela. AI was probably involved a little bit there too. I think some of the images might have been a bit different from what we were shown. But on the whole, the script probably played out just as we heard it would. But the point here is that it becomes clear how the Americans, with their military presence and control of trade routes, are undermining the Chinese here. And at the same time, we see that concerns about Taiwan and the possible invasion of Taiwan by China are increasing significantly. Some observers say that actions like the US military strike in Venezuela are now being exploited by China to claim Taiwan or perhaps see something else in the South China Sea. Others, however, say that the Chinese don't dare to do that right now because they don't see it as necessary at the moment, and that such a move by China does not depend solely on an event like Venezuela, but what is happening there has certainly thrown China's strategic planning into disarray. And there are signs that China is now changing its Taiwan strategy based on the situation in Venezuela. What do I mean by that? To put it another way, Venezuela has so far sold a lot of oil to China because Venezuela owes China money. Now it's getting the oil from China, and Trump put a stop to all of that. With his kidnapping of Maduro, Trump has temporarily brought the whole thing to a halt. Maybe it was necessary for us to see these videos of those oil tankers at some point, more being forced to turn around, that this was somehow a signal to China. But at the beginning of January, China immediately after that happened with Venezuela, they threatened the USA and even gave them an ultimatum. The Chinese said, if we don't get any more oil from Venezuela, then we'll take Taiwan. And you won't get any more microchips. So this deadline is running. It expires in 3 days. I don't know how much of that was just political bluster or if it's really something to be taken seriously, but it definitely happened. That wasn't really reported strongly in the media. It was mainly communicated between the embassies. And as you all know, Taiwan produces the best and most microchips semiconductors in the world. And if that's no longer available, then America is basically devastated, and of course Europe as well. That's actually a scenario you don't even want to think about. Maybe there's some diplomacy going on in the background right now. I've also heard that apparently the embargo against the Chinese has been lifted again. Now, this thriller is playing out right before our eyes, and we'll know in the next few days. We'll see what happens with Taiwan or doesn't happen. Hopefully, of course, nothing will happen. But that's an example that shows 2026 only started about 3 weeks ago. But the geopolitical global tensions that are happening all around us, they're just like that. They're playing out on many different levels. And it's not just about resources or individual conflicts, but more or less about the redistribution of power on Earth. The interplay between economic power, political pressure, and territorial claims, and raw materials like oil, that's also part of our title, among other things. We say war for gold, but gold also stands for raw materials in general. It's also a war over resources. And resources like oil are no longer a neutral market anymore. They are part of this strategic power politics. And whoever decides who is allowed to supply, who gets blocked, whose contracts are honored, and whose are no longer valid, that person is in charge today, as they say in English. That person is the commander, the one who controls the markets, and no longer like the supply and demand scenario we had until recently. So this development remains exciting, and it is not limited to the commodity markets. It affects everything, including currencies, capital markets, the entire financial market. And everything will increasingly be evaluated not just by normal metrics, but based on politics. these power blocks, this multipolar world will become more and more apparent. The question is, where will we position ourselves as Europe? Because at the moment, I feel like there's no clear direction. Maybe in the next few weeks, things will become a bit clearer. We'll see how things develop for Europe in this context. But this whole development is calling everything into question. So we're at the center of a hurricane here with intense political tensions that we haven't seen in many, many years. And precisely in this environment, a war over gold is once again taking on the role of a counterweight. I don't want to unsettle you, dear viewers, and I certainly don't want to scare you. In fact, I want to reassure you. Gold works independently of these global political power shifts. Therefore, the central conclusion for everyone from this story and from the story of Venezuela that we've just heard is, of course, that gold acts independently. And so we sincerely hope that you recognize this in time for your own little world, your sphere of influence, your family, your assets, your hard-earned money, that you are wise. And that you realize that with gold, you are independent from all of these events. You can just sit back and watch. And if you like, you can send me an email and let me know whether you enjoyed it or not. And now I'll hand it back over to Mr. Zurfman.
Yes, exactly. So China, Taiwan, the tensions, the global tensions are rising. The conflicts are not decreasing. And as we've already heard from Mr. Trinker, gold is the solution. But there are also other raw materials, as Mr. Trinker has already mentioned. Let's take a leap now and take a look at silver. Here too, the situation is becoming increasingly dramatic. What do the facts say, Mr. Draguljevich?
Yes, major banks and market positioning, a hotly debated topic for years now. Especially with the current silver performance, it's become even more so. And at this point, it's important to me to clarify one thing, because in the current silver discourse, this is often mixed up or emotionally charged. In recent weeks, numerous rumors have been circulating about supposedly massive short positions, that is, bets against the price by major banks. In particular, UBS Switzerland is repeatedly mentioned by name. And first of all, it's important here to distinguish between verifiable facts and mainstream media, dear viewers. Because currently there is no confirmed data proving that UBS Switzerland is holding a significant naked short position in silver, as is sometimes portrayed on social media or in certain comments, and I've seen this myself. Of course, I've done my own research, and that's why I want to present this here. Otherwise, UBS Switzerland would, at current prices, it would be the next Lehman Brothers story, I would say. Large banks regularly hold short positions as part of their trading and hedging activities, of course, not out of speculation, but because they act as counterparties for clients or to neutralize existing risks. And that alone, of course, does not constitute a systemic risk. And an additional look at the stock price development, which you can also clearly see in the chart here, helps to objectively assess the current rumors about allegedly massive silver short positions at UBS Group AG. Because the chart shown depicts the price trend of UBS stock from mid-2025 to early 2026, what stands out is a clear, stable upward trend, especially since late autumn. Despite a period of consolidation in the middle of 2025, the stock price has recently moved well above the 40 mark. Why is this relevant now? If a major institution like UBS Switzerland were actually carrying a significant and controlled risk from its alleged activity in holding silver short positions, it would be very unusual for this not to be reflected in the stock price at all over the course of several months. Markets usually react early to real risks, especially when it comes to major banks. And these major banks are under constant scrutiny from investors on the exchanges and from regulatory authorities. And the price trend shown here, therefore, does not indicate any cause for concern. Good stability, no signs of stress or crisis at UBS Switzerland. However, it would also be wrong to downplay the overall tensions in the silver market. That also needs to be taken into account, because regardless of the individual bank positions, we are currently seeing real tension in the physical market. And of course, this is also reflected in the current price. One point is often misunderstood in this context: silver shortage. When people talk about a silver shortage, it doesn't automatically mean that there is no silver left in the world or that mines have shut down. Geologically, silver is available and continues to be mined. These shortages that we are currently experiencing in the market are actually arising along the supply chains. Dealers who mostly buy on a short-term basis quickly reach their limits and then have to indicate on their websites that there is a silver shortage. That's exactly where statements like silver is currently unavailable come from, or that it is only available with long waiting times. These physical shortages, in turn, have an impact on the aforementioned paper market. When physical silver becomes harder to obtain, while at the same time, large volumes are being traded through futures certificates, that is, paper, the market naturally becomes more nervous. And in such an environment, even small shifts are enough to put short positions under pressure or to fuel rumors of a short squeeze. But regardless of whether individual institutions like UBS Switzerland are actually oversized in their positions or not, and this is exactly where it becomes apparent, the structural difference between market participants. For me, when purchasing, silver is not a short-term trading product, but a strategic component of our GVS precious metal strategy. For example, we have been working for years with long-term partners and stable supply structures, and these ensure that even during periods like the one we're experiencing now, with increased demand, we remain able to deliver while other dealers restrict or temporarily suspend sales. Have to. And that's exactly why we consider topics like UBS rumors, silver shortages, and delivery capabilities together. Not to create panic, but to show just how crucial structure and planning have become in today's precious metals market. Most people use solvers to create panic. We do the opposite. With us, you can get silver at any time in the duty-free warehouse or at our branches. It is sufficiently available. We've seen that in recent weeks as well. Customers have come to us and no one has left our branches without silver or gold. And yes, dear viewers, today a lot seems to revolve around Switzerland. And on that note, I want to mention again that we also have our own branch in Switzerland, where of course we plan our silver stocks just as long-term and proactively. Even more so there because Switzerland is especially interesting when it comes to silver. Among other reasons, this is due to the tax framework and the possibility of duty-free storage. And that's why today we've specially invited our colleague from Switzerland for you, Carlo, and he will give you direct insights into the Swiss business and of course what opportunities you have with us there. Yes, exactly. Now it's Mr. Del Prete's turn and we warmly welcome him. That's right. Here you can see Mr. Del Prete and in the background, the beautiful mountains of Switzerland. So, Mr. Del Prete, how is it going? How are things at our branch in Switzerland? I've heard there's quite a lot going on there. Yes, certainly. I'll give you a bit of an impression now. First of all, thank you to everyone who is joining us live today.
I'll start right away with what we see every day. The demand for gold and silver is currently exceptionally high. This isn't just theory, this is our daily reality. We notice it in the inquiries, in the appointments, and very concretely in the available stocks on the market. So first, a word to all our new customers. I am very glad that you finally found your way to us, and that you are addressing the topic of wealth protection early on. I'd be happy to quickly introduce myself. My name is Carlo Del Prete, Key Account Manager at Goldvorsorge Switzerland. Previously, I worked for a major bank for 28 years. I traded investment funds on the stock exchange and in the early days, even directly on the trading floor. Later, during the Corona period, I ran a restaurant for over 5 years. That experience shaped me because in the restaurant business, only one thing matters, the guest. And everything has to run smoothly every single day. Now you might be wondering, how does someone go from a major bank to running a restaurant? In short, my father, Sandro Del Prete, a well-known artist specializing in optical illusions, has a museum near Bern, in a large house. There's also a restaurant attached to it. The innkeeper quit unexpectedly, and I was asked if I wanted to take over the restaurant, at least for a certain period of time. And that turned into 5 years. But what has accompanied me my whole life is my passion for precious metals. Even as a teenager, I invested my pocket money in small silver bars. Later, I was out in the Australian outback with a metal detector. And yes, I did find nuggets. This interest in precious metals led me to gold investment. And last year, I had the opportunity to help set up our location in Switzerland. Just over a year ago, we opened our branch in Switzerland. Our location is in Apfikon, between the city of Zurich and Zurich Airport. That was a deliberate choice. Zurich is an international city and easily accessible. Parking spaces are available, but in limited numbers. And you can visit us at any time without an appointment. Our current opening hours are Wednesday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. without interruption, and Saturday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can also find the details on our homepage, goldresearch.ch. Our customers come not only from Switzerland, but also from neighboring countries, especially from Germany, Austria, but also France and Italy. Our French and Italian-speaking customers in particular appreciate that we can serve them in their native language. When it comes to wealth matters, every detail counts. And it helps enormously to be able to communicate in one's mother tongue. Our customers really appreciate that. For our clients, Zurich is the obvious premium location. Short distances, excellent infrastructure, high standards, and an environment that respects discretion. You might be wondering, why Switzerland in particular? Customers who come to us openly share what is on their minds. They observe the situation in Europe, they see the unrest, they feel the uncertainty, and they want to move part of their assets to a safe haven. This is where Switzerland comes into play. Switzerland is neutral. It is not a member of the EU. It is not part of NATO. It stands for strong legal certainty and stable property protection. It has a currency that is considered solid worldwide. In addition, there is what is called Swissness, namely precision, reliability, and high standards. This is especially crucial when it comes to security and storage. So, what is the situation like for us at the moment? I'll be frank. At the moment, we have a lot of inquiries, which can lead to waiting times. This is especially true for initial consultations and setting up storage solutions. Fortunately, many customers come to us well prepared. They already know what they want to buy. That makes things go quickly on site. It's even faster if customers plan ahead using the web shop. For example, by determining the quantity in advance, fixing the prices and preparing the payment. This saves time and makes the process smoother. At this point, a brief note regarding orders that concern Switzerland. You can also adjust the currency to euros on our homepage. And please always place your order through the Swiss homepage if the storage is located in Switzerland. Storage is a major topic. We now offer both high security storage and bonded warehouses in Switzerland. Bonded warehouses are especially interesting for silver. If silver in Switzerland is currently subject to 8.1% VAT in a bonded warehouse, silver can be stored without Swiss VAT if you order it with the storage option, as long as it remains in the warehouse. It is important to note that in the case of physical delivery from the bonded warehouse, Swiss VAT will be charged at the time of delivery. That's why it's crucial to know in advance what your goal is. Store or deliver. We explain the procedures to you clearly and transparently. So what is the current market situation? Many interested parties tell us that they can no longer get certain silver products from other dealers, or that they are only available with very high premiums. At the moment, we have an advantage here. Our parent company in Vienna planned ahead early on. That's why we are currently in the fortunate position to be able to offer additional silver products, namely bars and coins that are already scarce elsewhere. So don't wait too long and visit us in Zurich. For us, providing important advice is essential. In this market phase, a lot of typical mistakes happen. Some customers buy just anything simply because it's available. Others pay premiums that they later regret. Our approach is different. We want you to understand what you're buying and why. We talk about fineness, tradability, storage, and the purpose of your purchase. Because gold and silver are not just products, they are a decision. And that decision should feel right. Another important point is security. We check, we document, and we work with clear and established standards. You might now be wondering, what does our typical customer look like? To illustrate this, I'd like to share 3 brief examples from our daily work. A young woman, she works at an international high-tech company, sold her employee shares, and exchanged the proceeds for gold with us. She didn't say, "I want to get rich." She basically said, "I want to preserve value. I don't trust the system." That's why she bought several ounces of gold from us. Another customer came in with his wife. Both wanted a simple, peaceful plan. A plan. They decided to buy 3 ounces of silver every month for their retirement. Not as a gamble, but as a consistent habit. That's how you build substance over time. Finally, a father came in with his son. He bought several 1-kilogram silver bars from us. At the end of the conversation, his son was allowed to choose a colored collector's coin. That really reminded me of my first coin, a gold frenel, which I received from my father and uncle for my first communion. That's a tradition in Switzerland. You see, there are no typical customers. Everyone is unique and has their own story. We have customers of all ages, from retirees who want to secure their savings to young adults who want to build something for themselves. I'm especially pleased that so many young people are showing interest as well. If you'd like to combine your visit with a stroll in Zurich, there are a few places that are particularly suitable. First, Bahnhofstrasse and Paradeplatz. Here, you can really feel Zurich as a financial center. You will understand why this city has radiated trust for decades. Secondly, the Swiss National Museum in Zurich. If you're interested in history like I am, you'll find fascinating perspectives there on trade, value, and statehood. My personal motto is, history is the future of the past. Many things repeat themselves in similar ways over and over again. Third, the old town around Lindenhof and Münsterbrücke. There, Zurich reveals itself as calm, high quality, and very authentic. Fourth, the world of watches and chronometry in the city. If you love precision, you'll understand here what Swiss-made truly means at its core. Value, craftsmanship, and durability. Fifth, a view from the Uetliberg, Zurich's local mountain. This isn't a gold spot, but it grounds you. And many clients appreciate exactly this contrast. City, lake, tranquility, and panoramic views. Finally, what can you expect from us? We are a small team, which we are continuing to expand for you. The following values are important to us: efficient processes, clear information, and an approach that does justice to the subject. We take time for your questions, and we explain things clearly. You can reach us during our opening hours, as previously mentioned, currently from Wednesday to Friday, continuously from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and on Saturday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Outside of opening hours, you are welcome to contact us by email. We say it simply and clearly on purpose. We are here for you. not just when you make a purchase, but also afterwards. That is exactly what we mean by genuine gold care. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Del Prete, for the excellent presentation and the stories you shared with us today. Very, very empathetic and genuine. And with that, we return to the main topic of today's event, namely real security. And we continue with Mr. Trinker. As we've already heard from Mr. Dragoljevich, the high demand is leading to a shortage of silver. Earlier, we already talked a bit about China's behavior and response to recent events. Now let's take a look at their national currency, the Chinese yuan. How is it looking there, Mr. Trinker?
Yes, thank you very much and welcome back. Just briefly, dear Carlo, thank you for the nice description of Switzerland. I myself have wonderful memories. Many years ago, in another life, so to speak, I also worked in Switzerland twice for 2 years each. And there, for my birthday, I received a small gold bar from my boss given by my employer. And in the second year, too, and so on, I'm not allowed to say the name of the company, but it's a large hotel chain. Everyone knows it. But that was a very long time ago. And Switzerland is a truly wonderful country. My clients ask me, what do you think of Switzerland as a storage location, as a customs warehouse there? And I have to emphasize, Switzerland is in the heart of Europe, but it is not in the EU. Switzerland has a really great structure, which is organized differently than the EU. That means it's a great alternative for anyone who wants to be outside the EU, but maybe doesn't want to go too far away. We offer a variety of storage options worldwide, but Switzerland is top-notch. And especially in connection with our topic today, because we're talking about war and, of course, gold. And Switzerland, as far as I have noted here, has not been involved in a war for over 600 years, so many generations, and has always remained neutral. For all those who say, well, Switzerland is surrounded by the EU anyway, to that I can also respond, you can look at it differently. And you can also see it as being surrounded, but not inside Switzerland, rather outside of it. So Switzerland, I think very highly of it. Dear Carlo, thank you for your work there. And now, of course, I'm making the connection because this is about war and gold. And war is not just a war on the battlefield. War has many different forms, which we might not even consciously perceive. But there are also currency wars, economic wars, and as we've already heard today, the world is now reshaping, crystallizing again into blocks, not just two, but multipolar ones. That means 3, maybe 4 blocks. We have America, we have Russia, we have this whole BRICS constellation. We have Europe, and we still don't really know where we actually belong. Are we fish? Are we meat? This or that, that's yet to be decided. And then there's China. China is very dominant. And now let's talk a bit about China and what they're doing with their currency. Because when we talk about currency, about money, many people still think of the very simple basic model. Supply meets demand. The market finds a price. That's how we learned it in school. That's what the books say, but it has little to do with the reality of the major world currency. And the clearest example of this right now is China. China with its currency, the Yuan. So not the Dongguan, but the Yuan. I don't speak Chinese, so I'm trying my best to pronounce it correctly. So China actually controls its currency. Other countries probably do this too, but with China, it really matters because China is a bit bigger. For example, there's a report from Bloomberg, which is a news agency. This report shows very clearly how something like this works. Just so we've mentioned it, the Chinese central bank sets an official reference rate every day. They set it themselves. And this rate is, of course, stronger against other currencies than pure market forces would suggest. So it's a bit like the currency is on steroids, you could say. The goal, of course, is gradual stabilization and appreciation. And all that without harming their export economy, which they really still rely on very heavily and are dependent on, without putting that at too much risk. So with this, China is, of course, pursuing several goals at once. Limiting capital outflows, curbing speculative trading. And internationally, they want to be perceived as a stable currency area. because short-term capital movements always pose a huge risk. You can ask many countries that have experienced something like this, and that's exactly what they want to control. What's crucial is that this is a clear strategy, and the goal is to gradually internationalize the currency. That is in trade, in agreements between different countries, and in payment systems. And in this area, China is currently building the appropriate infrastructure with its own cross-border payment systems. Just like we have here in the West, I'll still call it that geographically speaking, with the SWIFT system, IBAN, and all those things, a system where everything works in no time at all. The Chinese want to build something strong themselves, something cross-border. And here again, the key word is to be dominant in the world again. But so far, China isn't doing it with weapons, but with the economy and with brains and cleverness. So you have to watch with interest, and it is exciting to see how the Chinese will continue to act in this area. Back to the currency, the daily reference rate. That's a clear signal from China to the world's markets, of course, because the market moves, but only within the politically defined boundaries. So China's exchange rates are, so to speak, an expression of how the political elite in China are currently feeling, joking aside. For investors, of course, this means a fundamental change. Currencies no longer reflect, as we just described in the textbook, they no longer mirror the fundamental data of an economy, but rather the balance of power. And capital controls, controlling the export and import of currency and so on, of course, reinforce this effect. Clear, stability for the state, higher complexity for investors. And in such an environment, of course, classic assumptions lose their validity. But that doesn't mean that all of this is bad, because in the end, they're just doing what America does, make America great again. Of course, the Chinese also have the right to make China greater. So they're also thinking of themselves, and in some ways, that's certainly justified for them. And where does that leave us? Gold? Gold, as always, stands outside of such mechanisms, and especially in a world that is becoming increasingly politicized, currencies are subject to political developments. Precisely in such a world, gold gains incredible significance because it is independent. And China is showing very clearly how modern monetary policy can work today. Control instead of a free market, fine-tuning instead of open intervention. But is that for them or for asset holders? In general, this means that currencies have to be interpreted differently nowadays. It's far too risky. Be careful. Keep your hands off things where you know they no longer follow normal rules. And instead, follow gold. And now I'll hand back over. Head over to the main central control room.
All right, so Mr. Trinker has summed it up. So currencies are also controlled, but gold and silver and generally precious metals and commodities are not. Let's stay in China. We have already displayed the appropriate image. We're taking a look at their current real estate crisis. She's been all over the news lately. How precarious is the situation, Mr. Trinker?
That's quite funny. I just looked at the picture, and for a brief moment, I was blown away and read it, Benko. But it doesn't say Benko, it says Vanke. And Vanke is basically the Benko of China, more or less. Actually, maybe even a few sizes bigger. And that's really the established real estate giant in China. And now, once again, it's back in crisis, and we'll get to gold in a moment. The arc will be drawn in a few words from me, and then it will come full circle again. Because the real estate market in China is going through a crisis, a huge crisis. And the relevance of this crisis, of course, extends far beyond Asia. Yes, so the real estate company China Vanke, or China Vanke, I think it's actually pronounced Vanke, even in China itself, is facing the risk of a default. And again, it's not a matter of months or weeks, but now it's down to days. Because according to Bloomberg, once again, Vanke is on the verge of insolvency. And the next deadline is at the end of this month. The deadlines have already been extended to try to contain the damage. But who knows what will happen at the beginning of February, whether it can be contained any further. China? For a long time, Vanke was one of the country's largest residential or real estate developers. As you know, the Chinese experienced a huge real estate boom for many years. In the end, it was also a huge bubble, and entire cities were built where no one lives. This company, Vanke, was always the stable one, especially compared to other major developers who have already fallen through the cracks and experienced payment defaults. Ultimately, too much was built, too much speculation took place. So you could nicely say too much was built, speculation was too high, too little was sold, and too much debt was taken on. A classic case, you could say. You couldn't really apply these points to many companies, but in this case, it truly fits Vanke. And now what happens next? Well, now they're obviously dependent on the mercy of their creditors. And whether they'll grant another grace period after January is more than questionable now, although the Chinese do tend to be pragmatic to avoid the worst case scenario. The company remains in a very precarious situation. And you might be asking yourself, well, why should I care about a company like that in China? You really should care because we're talking about enormous dimensions here. These are massive payment obligations that either get fulfilled or, if not, have huge consequences for many other companies. And looking at the bigger picture, as I already mentioned, China is in the midst of a huge real estate crisis. Some of the biggest developers, you probably know the names, Evergrande, Country Garden. Funnily enough, they all have such American-sounding names, but they're Chinese companies. They've already had massive payment defaults or have undergone huge restructurings. The Chinese are always clever about it and don't just let everything crash right away. They don't let things hit the wall immediately. So you have to say they're already experienced in a planned economy as well. So Vanke was previously considered one of the last systemically important developers, but here you can see just how fragile the situation is right now. It's questionable whether it can even be stabilized at this point. Why is this relevant for you? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. You can see that real estate in China and worldwide can no longer automatically be considered low-risk investments. This is a very relevant point for you as well. In the past, real estate was considered a good low-risk investment. That's no longer necessarily the case. So the era when land and new buildings were considered safe, tangible assets, that time you could say is over. We are now in the age of raw materials. As for real estate, it's definitely over wherever there is high debt and an oversupply. The Chinese themselves, and now it gets interesting, they've already made their decision, hundreds of millions of Chinese, including those in the middle class. So those who are more or less wealthy have decided they'd rather invest in, you guessed it, gold instead of real estate. For the Chinese, gold is now considered the safe haven. People are moving away from concrete to gold bars, whether it's for retirement planning, protection against inflation, simply saving, or building wealth. For the Chinese now, everything revolves around gold as well. And maybe to draw a connection to us here in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. I can confirm this for us here as well, because not a single day goes by, whether it's me or my colleagues, we're all one big team. Many thanks to everyone at this point, of course, where we don't talk to real estate sellers. Every day it's about real estate sales, people who are now investing their money in gold. And I often get asked, what should I do? What should I make of this? I always recommend to everyone, do you live there? Is that your house? And if not, calculate everything thoroughly, have it checked by a real estate expert once again. And then they cash out and make their decision. If the numbers no longer add up, then they have to take action. We are here for you, and of course, we will help you. And with that, back to the studio.
All right, that was China and the real estate crisis. So you can see that China is faltering at its core. There are also several topics about China today, but unfortunately, things look just as bad in Europe. The next billions for Kyiv have already been allocated. With these incredible sums of money, is the logic of debt being revealed, Mr. Dragoljevich?
Yes, I would perhaps rather call it the next clever subsidy at the EU level, because in December, the European Union agreed on a far-reaching fiscal policy measure. As the gentleman already mentioned, Ukraine will receive an interest-free loan of 90 billion euros, which is intended to secure both military expenditures and the state budget for the next 2 years. And this agreement is the result of a political compromise and attention after months of debate. It says a lot about the economic and monetary situation in Europe. First, it's important to take a closer look at the structure of this aid. This is not a direct grant, but a loan. So the EU itself borrows the money on the capital market and then lends it to Ukraine interest-free. And the guarantee is provided through the EU's common budget. This means the risk is borne collectively. However, not by all member states. Here's the catch. Countries like Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia have negotiated to not participate in the costs. Pretty clever, if you ask me, because these debts will probably never be repaid, or they suspect somewhere that these loans will never be paid back, and in the end, they'll be left holding the bill. And what's especially revealing is what hasn't been implemented. Originally, the plan was to use the frozen Russian state assets of around 210 billion euros directly to finance this. However, this model failed due to legal, political, and economic concerns. That's how it's officially phrased, of course. Above all, countries like France, Italy, and Belgium warned of possible retaliatory measures by Russia, for example, expropriation of European companies. That really shows the power at play here, Russia's power in Europe. And it shows just how sensitive questions of ownership have become in the international financial system. Instead, the order was simply reversed. The EU is making an advance payment, taking on debt in the market, while at the same time keeping the option open to use Russian assets in the future, but still possibly using them for repayment. This means that the loan taken out could potentially be repaid in the future using Russian assets. And if Russia provides compensation or establishes the corresponding legal basis for it, then we'll take a closer look at the whole matter again. Whether that will ever actually happen in this constellation, of course, remains to be seen. But what's important is that the 90 billion loan stands. For investors, this very point is crucial. These 90 billion euros are not a one-off exception. It just keeps going and going. And this has already become a major trend in some respects. They just keep printing, and simply spending it. That means by now, no one even knows how much credit has actually been issued. No one knows anymore how much cash has been handed out. This is a huge problem because political conflicts are increasingly being financed through these capital markets and by taking on new debt. This burden is simply pushed into the future and then pushed even further into the future. And no one knows whether it will ever actually be repaid. And the biggest problem here, of course, is the repayment. And the repayment is usually based on, for example, raising taxes or increasing other things. Prices go up, food prices go up, and so on. That means everything keeps getting more expensive. And who is ultimately left to bear the costs? Well, the citizens. And that's really the most important point about this whole issue. That means these debts don't just disappear. In the end, they have to be borne by the citizens. They have to carry the burden. And here too is where the connection to the precious metals market comes in, of course. That's why it's so important to consider gold here as well, because gold once again acts independently and in isolation from the euro and other credits or the mass printing of more paper money. While states take on debt and thereby risk economic stability, investors, of course, look for assets that are not part of this debt logic. And that's exactly what you need to do out there as well. Don't trust our financial policy, but take action yourself and build up your own gold reserves so you can simply ignore such scenarios if they arise. And what's interesting is that the very countries that reject such subsidies are also quietly turning to real assets. That means the countries mentioned earlier, like Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia, are themselves turning to real assets. You can also see it in the statistics. Their gold reserves are increasing month by month. And that's real evidence that even governments which ultimately reject such subsidies still prefer real assets and real security. And in this case, physical gold. Of course, I also have to say that by now, most countries have become smart, or rather smarter, which naturally leads to increasing competition for gold on the market. And for us at Goldversorg, this clearly allows us to draw a conclusion. This decision by the EU is not an argument against Europe and not a political judgment. It is an example of how strongly economic security, or rather, our future today depends on such political decisions. That's why I want to make an appeal at this point. Once again, do not trust the mainstream media, today's financial policies, or anything like that. Instead, take action yourself and build your own gold reserve so that you can ignore such information or such regulations in the future.
Absolutely, very insightful, thank you. Let's stay in Europe and take a look at hedge funds, Mr. Dragoljevich. What's the situation there? There's quite a bit to report on that as well.
Yes, that's a very important point here as well. I regularly look at the positions of the major hedge funds. Why do I look at that? Because the positions of such hedge funds provide important signals for the euro area. Because even before the political tensions around Greenland, for example, publicly escalated, major market participants had already placed their optimistic bets on the world. In recent days, these bonds have shifted from a clear long position, that is a bet on the price, on the euro, on a rising euro, to a slightly negative position. And that's remarkable because it actually represents the first real trend reversal in several months, as you can also see in this chart. Such position changes don't happen by chance. In this case, it's about the growing uncertainty for Europe. For example, looming US tariffs, geopolitical tensions, and the risk of a new transatlantic trade conflict. The euro initially reacted to this with losses, then recovered, albeit only briefly. But the message at the end of the day remains clear. It's not about the short-term recovery, it's always about the long term, and the long term means trust in the euro has become fragile. And here it's not just about the euro, but also about other currencies like the US dollar. And what's especially interesting is the technical side. Long-term indicators, which for almost a year had pointed to a stable upward trend for the euro, have turned negative for the first time. Historically, this does not automatically mean a crash, but it increases the risk of further phases of volatility for the euro. In other words, the downside potential is greater than the upside potential. Professional investors who are active on the stock markets every day tend to avoid exactly these kinds of situations, because that's exactly what's important for investors in the euro area, like you, dear viewers out there. And that's a very important and current signal. Currencies are ultimately really classic system products. I would also, in a way, label them as trust products. They reflect economic stability, political reliability, and international relations as well. But when geopolitical conflicts increase and at the same time economic weaknesses remain visible, this trust becomes vulnerable. And at the same time, the limits of traditional currency strategies are also becoming apparent. So there is no longer a safe side when it comes to currencies. And at this point, should the conflict with the US escalate, it could indeed put pressure on the euro in the long term, but it could also weaken the US dollar, for example, through capital flowing back to Europe or other political countermeasures. The result is not a clear winner among currencies, but rather increasing volatility in the currency markets. Historically speaking, if I think about it now, not a single currency has ever survived. You really have to let that sink in for a moment. All of them were created for a certain period, only to eventually become extinct. Even now, in an era of unlimited money, governments are still using currencies for the short term. At most, they get the most out of them somewhere, maybe even enjoy it. As I mentioned, the 90 billion in aid for Kyiv before the next one is simply introduced again. And it is precisely here that we can actually see the difference between currencies and real assets. The value of the euro depends on decisions, negotiations, or power dynamics. Gold and silver, on the other hand, stand outside of these lines of conflict. And that's exactly why the current development is extremely relevant. When you see that major investors are pulling out of funds or other assets, withdrawing their positions and fleeing to precious metals. And that's exactly what it is, real protection. And even the big investors recognize that. And at that point, when the big investors do it, just follow their lead. You don't even have to think for yourself. You just have to copy what the big investors do. They are pulling their assets or wealth out of traditional financial products and putting them into real assets, real physical assets. After all, we are all aware of the gold and silver price performance over the past few months, over the past year. I'll go into more detail on that later, but that's exactly an indication of why each of us can only benefit from gold and silver in such phases. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now.
Exactly. So trust is crumbling everywhere. You can see that here in a classic way in the chart of the hedge funds. Now we're heading back to Asia to Mr. Trinker. He was just in China a moment ago, and now he's traveling to Japan because over there, they're now turning off the money tap. And Mr. Trinker will tell us which markets are feeling this the most.
Yes, thank you very much. I've just landed in Tokyo. The flight was just a hop. It's really not that far from China to Japan. But jokes aside, right now, we're focusing on the financial system. Nicola just told us something great about the hedge funds and the incredible distortions happening in those markets. Now, you could say it's a war over money. And in the end, it all comes back to gold anyway. But here is actually something that many people might be hearing for the first time now. For a long time, I didn't know myself what had happened with Japan, but it's actually incredible. It's a huge disruption. It's certainly not right. Just because something is possible doesn't mean it's always right. Then what am I talking about? I actually need to give a bit of background. For many years, one thing was taken for granted. Whenever there were setbacks on the financial markets, people would buy because there was always liquidity available. There was plenty of it. Capital flowed almost without limit into stocks, real estate, and all sorts of other investments. But this development, you might not believe it, has a central driver. And this driver was extreme. You really have to think about how that even worked. This driver, this source of endless money, was extremely cheap money from Japan. It's actually pretty incredible. Extremely cheap money from Japan. And why is that? How does that work? For decades, Japan pursued an extremely loose monetary policy. That means interest rates in Japan were at zero or even in negative territory for many, many years. And that made the yen, Japan's currency, ideal as a funding currency. It was used to finance all sorts of things. If you take out a loan in Japan, you pay virtually no interest and invest it somewhere else. So international investors flocked there like bees to honey. They really couldn't do otherwise. It's honey for the bees all over again. They could take on debt at extremely low cost and, of course, invest that capital in markets with higher interest rates. There's a technical term for this. It's called the carry trade, borrowing and trading. And as long as interest rates were low and the yen was weak, this model worked perfectly. It worked. This went on for ages, and the capital was tied up in US stocks and European markets. And increasingly, it also flowed into highly speculative asset classes. But suddenly, oops, the whole environment is now changing completely. So, of course, a lot of people are left looking pretty clueless, if I may put it that way. Pardon my expression. Because for the first time in a long while, Japan is experiencing rising inflation. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And as a result, the Bank of Japan has started, dutiful as they are, to likely correct their extremely expansive monetary policy. Interest rates are only rising a little, but they are rising and they keep rising. The yen is getting stronger again because anyone who has been to Japan in recent years knows how incredibly cheap it suddenly was. So if you want to travel there, do it soon because it's going to get more expensive again, but it's still manageable. But as I said, interest rates are rising, the yen is getting stronger, which means it's getting more expensive. And what at first glance seems like a small adjustment has major consequences. because with rising interest rates, the calculations for these investors naturally change. Cheap money, invest it, great. But if you no longer have cheap money, then you've got a problem. Suddenly, loans become more expensive and the currency risks increase even further. And then there are all the leveraged strategies. They naturally lose their appeal, for one thing. And for another, there are many who go under, who end up underwater. And existing carry trades, they have to be unwound, they have to be closed out, and then capital starts to withdraw from these markets. For the financial markets, this is absolutely a turning point, a truly dramatic turning point, because when there is less cheap money, it may not mean a crash, but it definitely changes the rules of the game. It could also, or it might even still lead to a crash. None of us really know how deeply everything is interconnected and intertwined. But volatility is increasing and valuations are now coming under pressure. And the markets are very sensitive when negative news comes in. And especially news from sectors that are heavily dependent on this liquidity or still are. So, to sum it up, for investors, this mainly means one thing. The conditions that prevailed in recent years can no longer be taken for granted, to put it mildly. And in an environment where liquidity is becoming scarcer, stability once again comes more into focus. If you look at this over longer periods from a historical perspective, such phases are not a state of emergency, but rather normal cycles. In the end, these are market cycles. But this is where precious metals come into play as tangible assets, because tangible assets have an intrinsic value that does not depend solely on credit availability, or market sentiment. As you know, we have long been in the age of commodities. We are experiencing a super commodity cycle, if I may coin that term. I don't know if I just invented it now, maybe I read it somewhere before, but it's a commodity cycle that's just at its beginning. This is going to become much more dramatic. And precious metals, of course, they are the classic example for this. Gold has always been, ever since humans have existed, for thousands of years, the ultimate store of value. Physical gold is a form of money. Gold represents true and authentic money. And silver, as we all clearly know, also serves a critically significant role and has an extremely important function in the financial world. On top of that, silver, in addition to its monetary function, has a dual role because it is a key industrial commodity. Because a significant portion of global silver demand actually comes from the real economy, from electronics to medicine to energy production. And this demand is independent of stock market cycles. It exists regardless. And almost 100% of this silver has to be newly mined every year because it is present everywhere in relatively small amounts. It simply can't be recycled that much. So that's one function. Silver is already heavily utilized in this regard, and then there's its role as a substitute for money. So in a funny way, silver actually has a golden future, if you can put it that way. But of course, that doesn't mean your precious metals can guarantee price gains. That's not how it works. No, because with precious metals like gold and silver, it's about stability and preserving value. The fact that they are also experiencing price gains right now is just a bonus. Great, that's nice, but don't forget that inflation is actually eating away everything around you. And that's also reflected in the prices of gold and silver. So the current developments make it very clear. The era of almost unlimited liquidity is probably slowly coming to an end worldwide. That really doesn't necessarily mean that a major crisis is coming now. Let's wait and see. But it is a return to more realistic market conditions. So no more cheap money from Japan, and investors should now seriously consider what they've invested in. Which investments are heavily dependent on this borrowed capital and on low interest rates? Or should you rather go for something real, something with substance? Because in the end, it's not about any extreme scenarios, but simply about something long-term. And anyone who wants to protect their wealth needs to understand what's happening in the market and how quickly things can change. And in contrast to that, what options are there to invest in something that has an inner intrinsic value? And gold and silver have always demonstrated this well. That is always the prime example. It has an intrinsic inherent value and is independent of any financial market. Neither from Japan nor anywhere else. Dear insiders, take this to heart. Share this with your best friends, not with everyone, because if everyone knows, then everything will collapse. Only with the important people, and be glad that you have this knowledge. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Trinker. So there's quite a bit happening in the markets as well. Liquidity is becoming scarce, generally speaking. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, which can be felt in the financial markets. Why is trust crumbling? Trust in these financial markets, Mr. Draguljevic? Yes, well,
basically, as I mentioned earlier, trust in currencies, why that is crumbling. I'd like to elaborate on that a bit more now and also bring in a current example. And that example comes from India. And this example from India actually shows just how fragile trust in modern financial markets has become. The trading firm Jane Street, seen here at the top, one of the most successful trading houses worldwide, achieved an extreme jump in profits with its Indian unit within a single year. Net trading profits amounted to the equivalent of around 520 million euros, and post-tax profits were about 315 million euros. And that corresponds to an increase of almost 500% compared to the previous year. Shortly thereafter, the Indian stock market regulator naturally intervened and halted the firm's trading activities. And lo and behold, the accusation was market manipulation. Specifically, it concerns complex option strategies in which the underlying stock index was allegedly deliberately influenced, and from that systematically to generate more profits. And of course, Jane Street denies the allegations and is taking legal action against them. But what matters most for investors at this point is not so much the legal outcome or anything else like the stock market regulator, but rather the structural implications of this case. What becomes apparent here is the enormous imbalance of power within modern financial markets. High frequency and derivatives trading operate at extreme speeds, sometimes in milliseconds. Data access that is no longer comprehensible for traditional investors. Profits are not generated through long-term corporate development, but rather through technological superiority, AI, algorithms, for example, and automated market mechanics. And regulatory authorities usually only respond in such cases when the effects have already become very significant, as we can also see here with Jane Street. For investors, this is a major warning sign because financial markets only function as long as there is trust in the existence of fair rules of the game. And when individual market participants can make hundreds of millions in profits in a short period of time, and this then leads to regulatory intervention, it shows just how unstable the situation is. That's what these markets have actually become. And this is precisely where the fundamental danger of paper and digital markets becomes apparent. Everything that exists only as a booking, claim, or certificate, as is the case here, often does not legally belong to you directly, but is tied to parties such as banks, exchanges, or clearinghouses. And in these structures, several major market participants unfortunately always have their hands in the game. And of course, this creates dependency, a lack of transparency, and a constant counterparty risk. The physical assets, on the other hand, fundamentally work in a completely different way. Physical gold and silver, the way we trade them, are not promises, claims, or derivatives. In other words, not paper assets. They are real assets. They cannot be frozen at the push of a button, regulated away, or manipulated by the market. They cannot simply be mechanically manipulated away. Anyone who owns physical precious metals is truly the owner, without a counterparty, without system risk, and without political dependency. And this very case clearly shows that even highly professional market participants with enormous resources are not protected from regulatory risks. For private investors, this risk is even greater because they have no political or legal leverage. Take, for example, James Tweed, who makes 9-figure profits. And that's why physical gold protects them. Gold is very simple. You come to us, buy it, and just take it with you, or use a duty-free storage facility. You store it with us in the duty-free warehouse, and you have ownership without any counterparty, systemic risks, regulations, or loss of trust. Yes, it's your property, and that's what counts at the end of the day. And once again, here's my appeal. We invite you to come and invest in physical precious metals. That is the tangible physical asset, not some unreliable paper-based financial futures or complex derivatives. Thank you, Mr. Draguljevich. So the financial markets are also shaking.
And yes, I'm just hearing from the control room that we're planning a short break, dear viewers. After all the great and important information from our experts, let's now take a look at how you can specifically complement your portfolio with a true classic made of gold.
The Austrian 100 crown gold coin. It is a classic trade gold coin with a historical origin. It was first minted in 1908 for the anniversary of Emperor Franz Joseph I's reign. It was minted and still bears his portrait to this day. After World War I, the crown lost massive value due to inflation, but the gold itself did not. That is precisely why the 100 crown coin is considered a proven form of gold investment and a gift today. Yes, 100 crowns in gold. And we are moving right along and not wasting any time. We had Mr. Draguljevich with us at the start, talking about the financial markets. And now we're going to take a little leap and look at an example of the maneuvers states use to fill their coffers. How does that actually work, Mr. Trinker?
Yes, thank you. If it weren't so sad, it would be funny. Otherwise, it would just be an anecdote. But what I'm about to tell you as an anecdote could just as easily happen here, or who knows? Maybe it's just a testing ground and soon it will happen here too. So seriously, we're talking about a country that even though you hardly ever hear about it, is actually very significant worldwide, Indonesia. And so on the one hand, we're heading to Indonesia, and on the other, let's talk about, or let's address a global trend that also exists here. And this global trend is wait just a second. I wanted to check and see. Can you still hear me clearly on your end?
We can still hear you very well. I think
that very specific moment,
battery
has finally returned once more.
Yes, and you can hear us very well again too.
Exactly. We're only human after all. Even people are just people. All right, now I'm getting back to the thread. On the one hand, I'm talking about Indonesia, and on the other, about a global trend that has really taken hold here as well. This global trend is that more and more taxes and levies are being introduced so that states can plug their huge budget deficits and fill their gaps. And that's the case everywhere, not just here, but also in Indonesia. It's a problem. And that, dear viewers, is the war over your hard-earned money, so to speak. And this current example comes from Indonesia. You can probably imagine what that's about. There, the government is now specifically intensifying tax audits of the wealthy, especially affluent families and large companies, so they can plug their deficits, their budget holes. And now it's the big families who are in the crosshairs. And they're calling it intensified tax audits with a bit of an extra push. And this extra push, as I said, is specifically aimed at taxpayers with high net worth. Tax returns are being thoroughly re-examined to close any gaps. And of course, the state wants more money and even more money. And for that, they haven't just ordered these audits, but the families are also being required to make additional payments for the year 2025. On average, they're being hit with another $5 million or so, according to what has been reported by news agencies. When you ask what this is actually for, when you question it, there's always the compromise solution that you should definitely accept, because otherwise there are other solutions. Those other solutions we wouldn't even want to discuss. The compromise solution is then a deduction. And then you pay about half of the demanded amount. And to me, that basically sounds like extortion. So that's how far things have already gone there. That's how far the Indonesian state is willing to go to get money. And this targets people's assets. Whether, how, and when something like this might catch on here, we don't know yet. But don't just sit back, think for yourself about how you can protect your assets. And assets always sounds like being rich. So maybe I'll put it another way. Think about how you can protect your hard-earned money, the money you've saved by tightening your belt, after already paying 50% in taxes and then another 19% when you buy food, taxes, fees, and all sorts of other levies on top of that. So for the remaining portion of the assets you have left, think deeply about how you can carefully organize and structure your finances so that some excessively aggressive state government authority doesn't come after it as well. And maybe you could even proactively propose a reasonable and fair amount of money that you would be much better off paying in the end. So to put it nicely, diversify across different types of investments. Of course, you can also diversify across legal jurisdictions. And a little tip, Die Goldversorger is set up internationally. And also think about the physical form of your assets, e.g. gold and silver. And Indonesia, in the end, this story shows us this didn't happen to us, but it could happen to us someday. It shows us how important it is to really keep a close eye on the money you've worked so hard to earn. All of you, most families, you have to look out for others who can't earn anything themselves, or for those, or for children, or also for elderly people. You have a responsibility that goes beyond just yourself. And in that, you have the responsibility to make sure your wealth stays with you, the wealth you've worked so hard for. And that is extremely important. You have to take this seriously because the political factors around us, they change. Governments are getting more and more creative. Tax regulations can change very quickly. So please don't sleep on this. Take a look at it. Panic? No need to panic. But ignoring it is also the wrong approach. And if you have questions, you can also reach us regarding commodities like gold and silver. And with that, back to the lovely control room.
Exactly. So as we can see, the first countries are already starting to impose all kinds of taxes. We are focusing on the hard-earned savings that people have worked so diligently to accumulate over many years. And once again, we are taking a very close and detailed look at exactly what is happening right now with the global demand for gold as a safe haven asset. Mr. Trink already mentioned it, gold is on the move, and gold ETFs play a special role in this. They actually show the demand more precisely, Mr. Draguljevic.
Yes, that's right. So on the one hand, we have outflows from hedge funds, and on the other hand, with ETFs, we're actually seeing record inflows. And when we talk about gold in general, many people first think of gold bars, coins, and vaults. That's the classic image. However, a large part of the demand actually arises where you don't immediately see it at the ETF level. And that's exactly where we can currently observe significant movements. Gold ETFs are seeing record inflows, as you can also see in the table at the top right in fourth place. Gold ETFs with $108 billion and record inflows. And that's an important signal of how the professional market actually assesses risks. ETFs function somewhat like a seismograph for institutional investors, large investors. They react systematically and to a large extent with less emotion. When large amounts of capital flow into gold ETFs in a short period of time, it's no coincidence, but rather an expression of a changed perception of risk. And three factors play a central role in this. The first is geopolitical uncertainty, for example, international tensions. Fragile supply chains and volatile energy markets lead investors to position their portfolios more defensively. In such phases, capital is withdrawn from risky investments, that is, from system assets, and shifted into liquid hedging instruments. Gold ETFs belong exactly to this category. The second factor is the interest rate environment. Christian already touched on this a bit earlier. Expectations regarding monetary policy have fundamentally changed. Instead of rising real interest rates, many market participants now expect rates to remain stable or even decline. This increases the attractiveness of gold. And when real bond yields become less attractive, a non-interest bearing asset like gold gains relative importance again in this context. And the third factor is structural in nature. Gold is increasingly being used as a strategic counterweight in portfolios. So central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and large institutional investors are expanding their gold holdings. This long-term demand forms a stable foundation on which short-term ETF movements can build. The mechanics are important here. ETF inflows are not purely paper-based movements. This needs to be clearly differentiated. Many people think of ETFs as just paper, but when capital flows into a gold ETF, physical gold must be purchased to cover the claims. And that's the fundamental difference. This creates real, genuine demand in the market and amplifies the effect of these movements, including price movements. And that is also a clear indicator of further rising prices. For investors, ETF inflows are therefore an important informational signal. They show that hedging is once again coming into focus, and the focus here is quite simply on gold. ETFs reflect current demand, but they do not replace physical ownership. But as mentioned, demand can be represented through ETFs. All in all, however, this development is actually very clear. Capital is once again seeking stability. This means that large investors, major banks, but also small investors are looking for stability and less for paper systems, or other such things. And in this context, gold is once again taking on that role as it is now. Here it illustrates the central role. And alongside it, of course, as a pioneer here as well, silver also plays a role, so to speak, as the little brother.
Great. So that's how things are looking for the gold ETFs. Now, there was another event in recent weeks that was all over the media and quite dramatic. The power outage in San Francisco and Berlin, Mr. Trinker. Do you think incidents like these might become an even bigger issue in the future?
Yes, actually, I would even hope that this becomes a bigger topic. Not that it should happen more often, of course, God forbid. No, but that it finally sinks in for people, and of course for those responsible as well, that there is a dawning, an awakening happening. Here we can speak freely without a muzzle. This is war. This is also war, because war is not just the battlefield. As I already said today, it's not just economic warfare. War is also terrorist attacks, arson attacks, attacks on the vital infrastructure of a city where millions of people depend on it. And in the case of Berlin, it was an attack carried out by leftists. But it doesn't matter. Left or right, I've already said a lot about that. It doesn't matter. They're completely crazy, the radicals. Anyone who is radical and carries out attacks, but we already know that anyway. But we truly need to make sure that we fully awaken to the reality of the situation, that we address this critical issue and treat it with the utmost seriousness. We must ensure that we have comprehensive plans, robust protective measures, and redundancy, in other words, a reliable backup system ready for these situations. It is important to remember that things could potentially turn out much worse than they actually did this time. And you probably all noticed it anyway. It was often in the headlines over the past few weeks. The blackout is here. And for everyone who wasn't paying attention, I'm not talking about Black Friday, the blackout. Power outage, not a sale, power outage. Widespread power outages in major metropolitan areas, specifically in San Francisco on the west coast of the USA and in Berlin in the center of Germany. What does something like this mean for all of us? It's a war against infrastructure. In Berlin, that's definitely the case. As for what exactly happened in San Francisco, I don't know at the moment. Anything is possible. There in San Francisco, this was at the end of December, there was a power outage that lasted several days, and about a third of the city was affected. That's still about 130,000 households roughly. And it was caused by a fire at a substation. For the power grid, Essential areas of public life were paralyzed, lights out, shops and restaurants closed, no more local supply. There apparently weren't any large-scale looting incidents, though there were probably some smaller ones. Traffic also came to a standstill. And here in Europe, we had an extreme example right away in January. Berlin experienced a large-scale power outage. I don't know if it was a third of the city, or maybe it felt like half the city was affected. Thousands, even tens of thousands of households. And there were a lot of problems, especially for elderly people, of course. And as always in such cases, it's cold, no electricity, no light, nothing at all. No one has anything at home because everyone only shops for one day at a time. The awareness that you should prepare a little, that awareness just isn't there yet. Fortunately for all of us, we've had economic prosperity and abundance for far too long. And it is truly wonderful and remarkable that we had it. But in a certain way, it's made us all a little bit complacent and perhaps a bit soft. We've systematically and deliberately blocked out every single possibility of a crisis, so much that we're left feeling utterly and completely shocked and entirely caught off guard and vulnerable at the exact moment when such a catastrophic event finally occurs. Then hopefully this will be a lesson for many people. So now, on an individual level, everyone should prepare a little at home. It's really not that hard. But on an infrastructural level, I've seen the videos and pictures too. It's all stuff that honestly I could have done myself. With a lighter and maybe 2 or 3 more lighters, I could have taken down the city's power supply. You really have to think about how exposed it is. This infrastructure is, how easy it is to, through unprotected, unmonitored, critical connections, you could take everything down there. The Russians don't even need to come here. All they'd need is a few people with matches on our side, to put it bluntly. So back to the facts. Many people were without power. And of course, that hit the daily lives of Berliners very hard. Now there's a huge debate. Hopefully it won't be like it always was in the past, where there's a huge debate and then 2 or 3 people write something important, and then the topic is forgotten again. Hopefully that won't be the case this time, because blackouts, they're going to keep happening from time to time. Even if it's not an attack by some radicals, but just because something burns out, it will happen again. And that means disaster preparedness and taking precautions ourselves, not just relying on the state. We also need to rethink things and realize that to a large extent, we are responsible for everything we are ourselves, for our health, by eating properly, and for our families, by protecting what we have and investing it wisely instead of speculating wildly with some papers and not just believing in some insurance policies. People don't just believe it's all fine just because it's insured. By the time you get anything, you might have already starved or died of thirst. So it's about looking at dependencies and minimizing them. And on top of that now comes the whole digital aspect. We are so dependent on a digital system in every respect that everything can quickly reach its limits. However, I can reassure you, here at Goldvorsorge, we have a lot of redundancy. I'm still trying to think of the German word for it. That's when you have a system. And in the background, you have another system that can somehow cushion things if needed. And believe me, while we are digital as well, we are not just digital, but we also have many analog systems. We have very, very smart systems. We are also not dependent on the power grid, which is something I'm often asked about. What happens if there's a blackout? So what happens then? But I can reassure you about that. So basically, for all these situations, tangible assets like physical gold are the best solution to protect your wealth, and that is independent of power grids. And such situations, and I don't want to spread panic here, but rather offer a sober analysis. Infrastructure is always complex and always prone to disruptions. These 2 examples show that we can learn from that. And in the event of a blackout, this is a question I want to address as well. I would like to answer this publicly once again here. Yes, in the event of a blackout, the question arises, what happens to my gold and my silver then? In a blackout, the safest place for your gold and also your silver is the high security vault, ladies and gentlemen. During a blackout, you'll have completely different concerns, and I can only recommend that you make sure you have good friends, something to eat at home, something to drink, as I've already mentioned, Having some toilet paper wouldn't hurt either, but you don't need to start hoarding now, like you often see on TV. That's not necessary. That usually doesn't last that long anyway. Candles are also good, so you have a bit of light. Candles can even warm up an apartment, no joke. That's your biggest concern during a blackout. But your gold is safely stored during that time in a high security vault. You definitely don't want to have your gold with you if the blackout lasts a bit longer and the streets start to get a little unsafe. And many people keep asking me, how do I get to my gold during a blackout? The answer is actually quite simple. First of all, during a blackout, you need it the least. And it's safest in the high security vault because no one can get to it. But still, if you absolutely want to have it, you have the option to access it at any time. Because not only do we have our own power circuits, how that works is confidential, but we are independent from the grid. But we are also, among other reasons, that's why we are set up internationally. The gold supply, the GVS, exists in many countries around the world. And a blackout is certainly not going to happen in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Dubai all at the same time. So that's a highly unlikely blackout scenario. There's something else behind it. So no need to panic, dear viewers, but you can take precautions by storing your precious metals properly in a high security vault. And make sure you have a few good friends in your close circle whom you can rely on. And my personal recommendation, I'm quite the drinker, a few bottles of wine, a guitar, maybe even a deck of cards, that helps too. And you might even be able to have a good time. I have one of my best friends who
became a blackout expert. See, it can be quite nice even without electricity. But yes, jokes aside, the systems are actually extremely fragile, and Mr. Trink just described how easy it all really is. And here too, the right solution. Gold, everyone wants gold right now, Mr. Draguljevich, as shown by the gold leasing rates. I have to admit, honestly, I've been in the business for a long time, almost 10 years, but I've never heard of this term before, gold leasing rates. Maybe you can explain that to us a bit more precisely.
Before I go into this complex topic, thank you, dear Christian. When it comes to a blackout, we are definitely prepared. And at this specific point, I'll now move on to discuss the technical term gold leasing in more detail. So I work in the wholesale sector every single day, and I also deal extensively with sourcing the high quality goods that you, my dear viewers, buy out there in the market. And of course, I'm also in constant daily contact with all of the major international manufacturers. And so because of this, you inevitably have to deal with such complex industry terminology on a regular basis. These are really very important internal matters, or I would say insider information that I would also like to share with you, because these are actually very important indicators for the demand situation, but also for future price forecasts, price increases or price decreases. And when I talk about gold leasing now, what does that actually mean? So gold leasing rates are interest payments that you receive for lending out your physical gold. Historically, they often range between 2 and 5%, but can fluctuate depending on market conditions and offer an additional source of return besides the performance of gold itself. For many market participants, this is a metric that receives little attention, as I mentioned earlier. However, for those who want to understand the mechanics of the gold market, it is a signal to be taken seriously. Leasing rates are not currently rising by chance. We can also see it on the right in the chart. Silver is at over 35%. I already mentioned it earlier. Historically, it usually ranges between 2 and 5%. Leasing rates rise when liquidity tightens and when physical metal becomes harder to obtain, or when banks adjust their risk behavior. To understand why this is relevant, you have to look at how gold is used in the institutional sector. Banks, for example, large dealers and financial institutions borrow gold to hedge transactions, especially the major banks, mostly on paper, to provide liquidity or to cover positions. Gold serves as a neutral solution that is accepted worldwide. And when these costs rise, it either indicates an increasing need for capital or a shortage of physical metal. In both cases, this is an indication that the market equilibrium is undergoing a complete shift. And it's striking that this development coincides with declining deliverable inventories at major trading venues. Both in London and on the COMEX, for example, the proportion of gold that can actually be physically delivered has decreased. That means anyone who holds paper, that is paper gold, whether at the COMEX or in London, may end up disappointed because they might have to wait a long time for their physical gold. And at the same time, the number of market participants naturally increases on the other side, who prefer actual physical delivery. And instead of merely and automatically extending the existing contracts, you typically see this kind of behavior when it's no longer it's not just the price that's in focus, but the security of ownership. So two trends are coming together here: a dwindling supply of physical gold and a rising demand for exactly this physical gold. The leasing rates reflect precisely this intersection. And historically, periods of increased leasing costs have often been, so to speak, indicators of changes in the market. And in parallel, the behavior of the banks is also changing, of course, because as you can see, things are coming to an end. They are a global player when it comes to these leasing rates. But this mechanism, it must be said, does not originate in the precious metal itself, but in the financial system. That means at the end of the day, it is also regulated and determined there. Gold always becomes more valuable when trust, of course, becomes scarcer. And leasing rates react very sensitively to precisely this interest and these changes. For the gold price, this does not automatically mean an immediate upward movement, but if this situation persists for a long time, then of course it will be reflected in a price movement. And meanwhile, in the background, the forces of supply and demand are naturally being rearranged as well, because the consumer demand is, of course, exceptionally high, but the available supply can often be very limited indeed. And we have been seeing these significant market indicators in the course of the last several months, which clearly demonstrates rising leasing rates and a growing number of individual investors wanting physical delivery. However, many paper providers are currently struggling with this situation, and at this point, it's once again extremely important to mention you should always buy physical precious metals. Do not rely on paper gold, paper silver, or other such derivative products found on the primary market or the secondary market. Instead, you should always go to a reputable, established precious metals dealer like us and enjoy the security of owning real assets. Professional advice at our branch. And make sure to purchase the correct type of physical gold bullion for yourself so that you don't end up with unnecessary complications related to paper assets, as you can clearly see currently unfolding across the global financial markets.
Absolutely. Thank you for this presentation. A very interesting concept, perhaps. Also interesting for our viewers are indicators that measure the price or signal the markets in advance. And yes, a major signal is also this scarcity. This is also reflected in the price. Since our last webinar in November, the gold price has broken numerous records again. Why is it breaking out right now, Mr. Draguljevic?
Yes, well, basically, we have actually already thoroughly mentioned the specific reasons for this. Christian described it very well indeed, but discussing it among many other things, specifically in relation to the complex Venezuela issue. For me, there were both some outflows and some inflows, but let's take a look at this fantastic chart here. The yearly chart of gold in US dollars. Incredible performance. And especially in the year 2025, gold has already delivered an incredible performance. And the fantastic thing is, in 2026, this trend is naturally continuing. And the price has once again reached new all-time highs. We're talking about over 5,000 US dollars per ounce. And that sounds spectacular, but it's no coincidence. As we saw yesterday on January 26th, gold reached a new all-time high of over $5,000. And this development is nothing more than the result of structural shifts in our current crumbling global monetary system. Central banks have kept their purchases at record levels. And in the third quarter of 2025 alone, that is at the end of the year, 220 tons of gold were purchased. Measured in US dollars, that's about $25 billion. And here we see the true core of the matter. While paper currencies continue to be printed and lose value, capital is flowing into real assets. And let's take a closer look at all of this for a moment. The breakout from the consolidation zone between $3,200 and $3,400 last year has established a bullish structure that is now continuing into 2026. And at the center of this is the ongoing demand from Asia and other BRICS countries. For example, in September 2025, China alone imported 115 tons, which is the highest monthly import since 2018. In India, gold jewelry sales rose in the third quarter by, we're talking about a spectacular 27%. So the decisive factor is the geopolitical shift. US trade conflicts, tariffs, European nations, threats over Greenland, the Venezuela crisis, protests in Iran. So you see it's getting more and more, not less. And it also has to be said at this point, so far we haven't really solved anything. So it just keeps going and it keeps getting more. I have the feeling that all the conflicts and all the additional short-term issues are somehow oriented around the mountains of debt we're currently creating. So it just keeps getting more and never less. So it's important to understand here, physical gold, unlike paper gold, cannot be printed. And even major players like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and even Bank of America are talking this year about a price target of over $6,000 by the end of 2026. And that's exactly what you shouldn't ignore, dear viewers. In a world with exploding debt, physical gold becomes the turning point. You can see it here, and those who bought gold in time or have bought it by now feel it even more strongly. But even at this point, we've mentioned many reasons. I've also said it's not getting any less, given the current issues, as I would call them. That is precisely why right now remains an exceptionally good time for you to invest your capital. And it is exactly because of this current market situation. At this point, we saw last year's performance. And of course, this will continue to develop here as well. And it's also important to mention that in 2025, gold reached 50 new all-time highs. Incredible. And this performance was driven by the reasons already mentioned: geopolitical uncertainty and an increasingly weak US dollar, in other words, weak currencies. And so, once again, a word of advice: don't wait. There is no perfect time. What's important is to invest. In physical precious metals, contact us anytime. We're here to advise you. And at this point, it's important to always invest in a timely manner and not wait for the perfect moment, because it doesn't exist. That's also important to mention here. And here's another interesting fact on the side. Before the webinar, I went to our IT department again and asked them to analyze how many visits we currently have on our website each day. And I couldn't believe it myself, over 20,000 visitors daily on our website. And I have to say, this number really makes me happy. When I see that private investors are now securing their wealth and no longer trusting the traditional system products, that of course makes me happy. And here too, I always say, keep it up, visit us, and invest in physical precious metals, both silver and gold. You can't go wrong with that. You can only gain security from it. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Stefan.
All right, so at a high point, gold is at an all-time high. As already mentioned, many records have been broken, and there will certainly be more to come. Unfortunately, the high prices of gold have also become very attractive to the criminal elements among us. Mr. Trinker, just how important is this today? Now we see the images. It was dramatic all over the media. How important is it to store your precious metals properly? I mean, to store them securely, maybe to store them correctly?
Well, in a way, this is my Sermon on the Mount, and I've been preaching it for many years. It's kind of an oldie, a classic. Now it's really about the intense and ongoing global struggle for physical gold, namely for yours. This is the war for your gold, and you must bear the ultimate responsibility if you get caught up in this conflict. You have the clear option to get out of this difficult situation by securely protecting and properly storing your precious gold assets in the safest and most reliable manner possible. Because what we're seeing here happens again and again. We're now talking specifically about the break-in. At a savings bank branch in Gelsenkirchen in the Ruhr area, North Rhine-Westphalia, just recently. But I've said this so many times, like a broken record. My phrase keeps coming up, I have to tell you again. And the phrase is, I've already told you 1,000 times. Why don't you listen to me? Gold does not belong in a safe deposit box. I'll tell you why in a moment. So the setting of this story, Gelsenkirchen, Ruhr area, but the setting repeats itself at regular intervals, and sometimes it gets more coverage and sometimes less. But believe me, it happens all the time, and often it's covered up because it's so embarrassing. The banks don't even want people to report on it at all. It keeps happening. It's happened near Vienna, in Mödling, Frankfurt comes to mind, Amsterdam, a huge heist, and so on. Halle is another example. Shortly after Gelsenkirchen, there was something in Halle. Most of the time, we don't hear much about it. If there are any pictures, they look like this. In one way or another, there's a hole somewhere, or all the metal safety deposit boxes have been pried open, and everything is scattered everywhere with documents. Why documents? Nobody cares about those. But that's exactly the point. The safety deposit box is there for the document. So what happened? Several perpetrators gained access to the Sparkasse bank building via an adjacent parking garage. And then, as you can clearly see in the picture, this is interchangeable. You could use it for many such cases. They worked their way into the vault, and using special tools, a huge number of safety deposit boxes, several thousand, I believe, were broken into. According to the police, over 3,000. There's a lot that could be said about this. For one thing, what you see here is definitely not a high security storage facility. A high security storage facility is never a large room where you just drill through the wall and so on, where everything is in one room. That wouldn't even be feasible from a structural standpoint. From a security perspective, that wouldn't work either. People say high security storage, but in reality, our high security storage facilities are truly high security because they're made up of many high security safes that really can't be broken into. But back to our amusing story, if it weren't so sad for the people who suffered the losses, because the exact amount of damage, well, you can't really say. There are estimates in the high double-digit or even triple-digit millions. Why can't you say exactly? Well, you have to prove how much you actually had in there. Even if you had a lot of gold stored, who is going to believe you? The pictures always look the same. Documents scattered everywhere. I've already mentioned that. No one wants to take those, but that's exactly what safe deposit boxes are for. Safe deposit boxes are perfect and ideal. For documents and maybe your aunt's savings book if she still has one, but definitely not for your gold and silver. Years ago, we even made another video about this, showing very similar images. And the scene repeats itself every time because the next day, hundreds of people are standing in front of the branch demanding answers. And of course, those answers don't come so quickly. And as always, the problem is the insurance, the ability to prove things. For many, the whole thing is also embarrassing because one person might have kept something in there that their partner didn't know about, and so on. And a few days later, a similar incident happened in Halle, Germany. Exactly the same pattern. The damage there was a bit less, but it shows that this isn't an isolated case. It's happening all the time. Bank safe deposit boxes are a service function. They are there for many everyday purposes, but they are not a high security solution, ladies and gentlemen. They are easy to break open and poorly secured, and even worse, insured. So easy to break into. Thousands of people walk just a centimeter away from their golden treasures. Every day, poorly secured and even worse, insured. What more could you want? We have even more arguments. The events make it very clear to us. The question of proper storage is not just theoretical, it concerns your very existence. Should you do something like that? Proper storage is becoming more and more important, and hopefully more and more people will wake up to that. In fact, I can actually confirm that now because we have long, long lines of people in front of our branches. And among them, there is a huge rush for our high security storage. And of course, there are also many people who come to us from safety deposit boxes, because with us, you can also store precious metals you've already purchased. Because in the end, gold and silver belong in a proper high security storage facility. And as I've said a few times now, not in a safety deposit box because you can't even insure it there. Yes, that's just how it is. We've already heard about queues and at the storage facility itself. Of course, there can be waiting times now. It's a mix. There's a lot happening right now worldwide, politically and geopolitically. We've heard a lot from Venezuela to China, the USA again, and Japan. It's a complex situation, and a lot of exciting things could still come out of it, but the queues aren't going to get any shorter because of that. So please, don't panic and don't worry. You're actually on the right track. You've probably already made all the necessary preparations, but your friends, your best friends, you should inform them. With us, you can do a lot, maybe even everything by email or over the phone, including setting things up. And you can also arrange a phone consultation because it's important to plan ahead. Even if you're only planning something bigger in a few months, start preparing now. Contact us, get in touch early before the queues get even longer. And of course, as I already mentioned, we can always arrange a phone consultation. That might not always happen the very next day. Sometimes my whole week is already fully booked, but we'll make it work and no one gets left behind. I can promise you that. Sometimes it takes a little longer, but just a bit of patience. You can make a purchase at any time anyway. Price locks, nailing down a price so it doesn't slip away from you. You don't even need a consultation appointment or anything for that. But I also have many employees and colleagues who support me in this. A very special and heartfelt thank you to everyone who is working with us during this especially busy time. They put in so much effort and really work a lot of overtime. And despite all the stress and pressure, they always remain friendly and warm so that everything can truly be taken care of promptly. So a heartfelt thank you also to my colleagues and employees, and of course to you, dear viewers. You are truly at the center of it all. And if you are interested in all these developments surrounding the precious metals market, I assume you are, otherwise you wouldn't be here right now. All these geopolitical events, the market movements, and the concrete effects on gold and silver and on your life. Please also visit us on our channels on the so-called social media in modern terms. We have a broad presence. We're on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, of course, and so on. You can find us under Goldvossorge GVS. Just enter that name and you'll find us. You can also check out the links on our pages, or as Nicholas already mentioned, visit our Goldvossorge website, just like the many 20,000 visitors who do so every day. Or simply go to YouTube and watch videos that are uploaded daily by us, where you can also see and assess current developments. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. I'll move on and we'll see each other again shortly in the Q&A session.
Absolutely. We are planning to take a step forward. Indeed. Because once again, we have an incredible record number of questions that have been submitted, and we hope to address all of them. We will try to answer every single one. But before that, we have one last presentation from Mr. Draguljevic. It's about silver. We've already heard quite a bit about gold. Gold prices, records, but we must not forget about silver. Over the past 3 months with silver, in fact, ever since our last webinar, Mr. Draguljevic, yes, we've seen massive gains. I'm sure our viewers are very pleased about that. But what are the main reasons behind this? It's really incredible, isn't it? Right, Stepan? It truly is incredible. And before I go into more detail about all this, dear Christian, thank you so much for your efforts. Yes, also for the storage, for the excellent customer consultations, and of course to the whole team as well. Yes, silver, right now.
There are a lot of reports about a silver shortage. That's why. As so often, it's worth taking a closer look here to see what is actually meant and what is important. Don't always believe everything you hear in the mainstream media or elsewhere. You have to examine things carefully first. So there are always data and facts, so you can assess things accurately. And first of all, to be clear, silver as a raw material itself hasn't suddenly disappeared. It's as simple as that. And there is no situation in which too little silver can be mined worldwide or the mines are empty. Silver continues to be mined and the geological reserves are well known. So from this perspective, we're not talking about a real physical depletion of the resource. What we are currently experiencing, as I mentioned earlier, are bottlenecks in the supply chain. And that's a crucial difference. Silver has to be processed, meaning it needs to be minted, cast, transported, distributed, and so on. And it's precisely at these points that during tense market phases like the one we're experiencing now, with the current price surge, delays keep occurring. Mints are working at full capacity, transport takes longer, and production windows are tighter. Many smaller dealers are simply not prepared for this, and that leads to the impression that silver is scarce. In reality, it's often the case that goods available at short notice are missing because dealers keep only small inventories or only react once demand has already risen sharply. In that case, it's usually already too late. In purchasing, we consciously follow a different approach. So for us, silver is not a product that you only buy when the market starts making noise. As Christian mentioned earlier with duty-free storage, or our colleague Carlo from Switzerland, for us, silver is a fixed component of a long-term strategy. And that's why we've been working for many years with long-term supply contracts with all relevant manufacturers. And these are exactly the kinds of information we receive as well. We get them daily from the manufacturers, and these contracts exist regardless of whether the market is calm or tense at the moment. And that's exactly why silver always remains available with us, even during difficult phases. A good example of this is the current situation. While there is talk of shortages in many places, at the same time, major projects are being launched, such as the world's largest silver bar in Dubai recently, with a ton. So we're talking about a ton of weight. So that's kind of a contradiction in itself. On the one hand, there's talk of a silver shortage, and on the other, they're producing a record-breaking silver bar just like that. And that makes it very clear silver is available. So the crucial point isn't whether silver exists, but rather who is prepared and ready when demand rises. And demand is rising dramatically. And it's very important to note that silver is not just a precious metal. It's increasingly becoming a strategic raw material as well, used in industry and technology. You can see that here on the chart to the left. Just the demand from the photovoltaic industry alone has increased by 289% over the past 9 to 10 years. And all of this, of course, increases the structural demand for silver. And on the other hand, more and more investors are suddenly discovering it. Silver as a complement to gold. Of course, our recommendation is always a mix, both gold and silver on the one hand. And naturally, that puts additional pressure on availability. So basically, I would say, at this point, stay calm, don't panic. But silver is not a panic product at the moment. There is still enough silver on the market. And for anyone who is surprised today to find that delivery times are getting longer or dealers are sold out, this is not the end of the silver market, but rather the consequence of a lack of planning. And therefore, in this context, whether in the GVS context or the Goldversorger context, I would like to convey one central message at this point. We don't just react to shortages, we anticipate them in a timely manner, and availability with us is not a matter of chance, but a promise. And it is exactly this promise that we want to give to our customers out there. And this is also the result of our long-term strategy, which we have built up over many years, establishing ourselves as a reliable international partner in the market. And that's why, give us a call at this point. The silver is not gone. With Silbervorsorg, the silver is not gone. With Goldversorg, the silver is also not gone. Give us a call. Call Christian, our colleague from Switzerland, or Carlo. We always have silver available. With us, you get everything at any time, including duty-free storage. And exactly as we already mentioned in our last webinar, or rather, as I talked about we talked about silver, about the gold price, about the silver price. I've already mentioned the gold price, and now I want to continue from there. with the silver price and silver performance. So what can we say about that? The best comes at the end. Let me say one thing at this point. Silver is the underestimated winner. The price has reached spectacular highs of over $114 per ounce. This rally is nothing more than the result of structural deficits and exploding industrial, but also, be careful, private demand. Here we see every day in our work that private demand continues to rise day by day in the silver sector. And as we've seen in recent months, silver has experienced a spectacular 280% year-over-year increase. At this point, congratulations to everyone who prepared with silver and stored enough silver in duty-free warehouses. And what's interesting is 2025. Let's take a quick look at 2025. Back then, we still had a price of $30. And basically, we were always in the consolidation phase between $30 and $40. And after the $40 mark, so from the $50 mark, we suddenly saw a bullish surge upward. And we are currently reaching a price of over $110 per ounce. Yes, silver is not only valuable monetarily, but also essential for industry, green technology, electronics. As I already mentioned earlier, and at this point, I'd also like to refer back to the gold-silver ratio, which I've explained in many of my videos. Historically, a ratio of 1:30 or 1:40 is considered normal, somewhere in that range. For a long time, even in 2025, we had a ratio of 1:100. And it was exactly during that phase that the industry bought in and stocked up on a lot of silver. A strategic move, of course. Guess what ratio we're at right now? Yes, at 1:45. So we're now back to a normal ratio, you could say. Before that, silver was extremely undervalued. And now we're back to a historically normal ratio. That means all the scaremongering out there about silver being expensive and so on is not substantiated. You can clearly see it in the ratio. We're back in the normal green range. And exactly, that's very important on the one hand, especially when it comes to demand. Here it's crucial. It's always about physical demand and inventory levels. In London, silver stocks have also shrunk from 850 million ounces to just 200 million ounces. That's a decline of over 75%. This means that most people have taken delivery of their silver in physical form because they simply no longer trust the classic paper system. So it's important to understand silver. Unlike paper, it cannot simply be reproduced, and that's exactly what you shouldn't ignore, dear viewers, in today's world with the currency risks we currently face and the deficits. Silver is once again becoming a crucial factor alongside gold. So silver and gold are currently on the same level again, and that's the key point. That means make sure to invest in physical silver and physical gold in good time, and then, of course, enjoy your security. You have secured your wealth, and that is the crucial point. So what happens next? That's always the question. How will things continue? Where do we stand? End of 2026? I actually get this question almost every day, and I have to say we've already planned our next webinar in advance. So even before this webinar, we had a brief discussion about what we would do for the next webinar. And we decided that the next webinar will focus on silver, and we will prepare an exclusive silver webinar. And of course, at the next webinar, I will, of course, take a closer look at the upcoming journey of silver and analyze it in more detail. And of course, I will also explain to you how things will develop until the end of the year. So at this point, buy physical gold and silver. Now is once again the right time for it. Of course, there can always be setbacks, and when that happens, take advantage of them, but it's not too late. No need to panic out there. We are here for you. Call us anytime if you need information. And most importantly, make sure to register for the next webinar so you don't miss it. The important information, our insider insights, and how the journey of silver will continue this year.
All right, thank you, Mr. Draguljevic. And we are at the end of our presentation round and are now moving on to the most popular part of our live event, the Q&A session. I asked the control room to bring our three experts back on screen. We have Mr. Draguljevic, Mr. Trinker, and I'm sure Mr. Del Prete will be joining us shortly. I won't wait, and we'll start right away with the first viewer question. As is well known, LBMA and COMEX gamble with paper silver. Could they collapse due to increased physical deliveries, Mr. Draguljevic?
Yes, no. Just kidding. I only said that to shock everyone out there who holds paper. Everyone always talks about how these systems will eventually collapse, but in reality, it looks quite different. These are extremely clever, well thought out systems, especially COMEX and the LBMA. All these paper systems, and an immediate collapse of these organizations or these entities is unlikely. And they've actually been under pressure for decades if you look at the numbers more closely, not just since yesterday, and up to now they haven't collapsed either. Of course, the pressure keeps increasing, especially since, as I already mentioned, the stockpiles in London have dropped by 75%. But in a system that operates predominantly with paper contracts, of course, if there is an increased demand for physical delivery, the markets can quickly reach their limits at some point. And most market participants will never see physical metal at these institutions. That's always very important to mention when it comes to paper. But in this case, when customers want to convert their paper into physical, in most cases, you see cash settlement, delays or changes in regulations. And that's the crucial point. That's also why somewhere there is unlimited money so that such a collapse can somehow be compensated for. That means you want to exchange your paper gold for physical gold, and in return, you simply get paper money. What was printed on the other side in school quantity, and of course, it's always very important to read the fine print because that's where it says it. Most of the time, it's in the fine print of the paper products. And that's where the big risk lies, which is why physical precious metals are always so important, so the market regulates. And then on the other side, the market, of course, regulates everything. And if the stocks are suddenly empty, yes, and they're completely under pressure, then the price will, of course, simply regulate everything. Yes, that means the price will simply reach new highs, and that's exactly how it will continue.
All right, thank you for your assessment. The next question goes to Switzerland. Why is Switzerland considered so much safer than Europe, Mr. Delbret?
Yes, we've been hearing this question almost daily for years. Switzerland isn't magically safe, but is structurally different. As we've heard, it's politically neutral, not a member of the EU, has its own currency, and very low national debt. It has an extremely long tradition of protecting private property. The crucial point is that Switzerland doesn't have to co-finance EU bailout packages and isn't part of joint liability. Money, politics. While the Eurozone pools its debts, Switzerland is primarily liable for itself. Historically, this has always proven effective. That's why Zurich is one of the most important global hubs for precious metals. At Gold Warsaw, we deliberately leverage this stability for our clients. Bank-independent storage in Switzerland is not a luxury, but risk management. Don't forget, security isn't created overnight, but over decades of stable policy.
Thank you for your assessment of Switzerland. Next question, what do we have here that's interesting? Yes, here's a great question from Mr. Draguljevic again. Should I buy gold now or should I wait until it gets cheaper again? I'm laughing because I've already heard this question many, many times today from numerous clients.
That's what I was about to say too. So I'm probably not the only one who hears this question every day. All of us involved hear this question every day, of course. And in the long run, there is no perfect timing. I've already mentioned that earlier. Of course, I always say, take advantage of price drops. If you can specifically catch these price drops or hit them, that's perfect. But in the long run, you shouldn't wait because physical gold and physical silver are not speculative products. Physical gold and physical silver are security. And those who wait often end up waiting for years or a very long time and unfortunately end up buying at a high price. With us, it's like this. Many customers combine one-time amounts with regular purchases so you don't put yourself under pressure. Somehow get out or realize these price gains. And with GPS, there's always the buyback guarantee, so the other side of the coin, so you're not trapped. The crucial thing is to actually get your foot in the door with us in the first place. That is to a branch office, ideally, perhaps even directly in Switzerland, and then buy your physical precious metals there. And exactly then you don't have to worry about whether this is the perfect time, whether you're too late, or whether it might get even cheaper.
By the way, I'm just getting a note from the control room about this. It's just come in once again on a US dollar basis. The next record has been broken. For everyone who's waiting, that's what happens when you wait too long. Yes, that's something we've known for 10 years now. My colleagues and I have experienced it just as long, haven't we? Most of the time, you end up waiting longer for a dip.
Maybe the first currency has already collapsed. At the same time,
exactly, we don't know. We'll take a closer look and analyze it after the live broadcast. We'll continue with the next questions. What specifically triggered the surge in gold and silver prices last month? Venezuela? It can't be the high national debt. That has never happened before. Large impact. What is your assessment of this, Mr. Dravoljevic?
Yes, basically the strong increase in gold and silver prices last month, respectively. I wouldn't just relate this to the last month. Actually, the developments of the past months can't simply be reduced to individual events like Venezuela or other short-term incidents. And in the past, high national debt alone was indeed not a sufficient driver of prices. But what's crucial today is that the mechanism has fundamentally changed. What does that mean? In the past, new money was created and mostly flowed into government bonds, usually in another currency. Today, money is printed and finds its way directly into gold. And that is exactly the real turning point in all of this. Trust in paper-based products, as I have already mentioned, has fallen so far that even governments and central banks' government bonds, SO, basically no longer trust their own products and are therefore buying gold. And Venezuela and the whole Greenland issue, of course, at most plays a short-term role in the media. The real driver, however, is a global loss of confidence in our money and paper assets overall. So no one wants to hold money long-term anymore. Everyone wants to have real assets, whether it's major banks, private investors, or institutional investors. And it is precisely this global shift that is simultaneously affecting the many markets, stocks, bonds, gold, and so on. In the end, one thing always remains constant. Physical assets like gold and silver, yes, they don't play along with all these system games and of course retain their real value. And it is exactly these mechanisms or these change mechanisms that play a significant role in the current rise and will continue to do so in the future.
Great. Mr. Trinker, is my gold really safer with you than at a bank?
Yes, thank you for the question. We've already discussed this in detail today anyway. Keyword Gelsenkirchen, we've talked about that. And in reality, you really can't compare the two. Because if you look at it as an example, at the bank, with a safe deposit box, thousands of people walk just centimeters away from your assets, simply because it's just a millimeter thick layer of some safe deposit box. People are allowed in and out, at least with the usual safe deposit systems. But even with somewhat better protected ones, you can never really compare them to proper high security storage. Because with high security storage, no one goes in and out. Only a few logistics personnel are authorized, and only those who are authorized are allowed in. They handle your storage or inspections. Then nothing else. That's the most important criterion. Secondly, in high security storage, we're talking about high security safes, not just vault rooms, which is more of a fantasy, but actual safes that these safes cannot be broken into. And we really use only the very best with the highest security standards, the highest security class. There's simply no comparison. But the safe deposit box does serve a purpose. It's intended for jewelry, for certain documents. That's what it's designed for. In that case, it can be safely reported to the safe deposit box register, the account register, and to Finance Online. You have nothing to hide. You only have documents in this safe deposit box. So everything actually speaks its own language. Of course, anyone else could try to trick them, but that would be wrong. And I'm not even going to mention insurance or insurability anymore, because most safe deposit boxes are not adequately insured. And how will you ultimately prove what you had in it? So the answer is obvious or right on the tip of your tongue.
Exactly. Thank you for your assessment. What does Swiss neutrality actually do for me if things really get turbulent in Europe, Mr. Del Prete?
Yes, since the geopolitical tensions of recent years, we get that question very often in the chats. Neutrality does not mean invulnerability, but rather freedom of action. Historically, Switzerland has been neutral in almost all conflicts, and as a result, it has actually maintained stability. While other countries have to implement sanctions, counter-sanctions, or other measures, Switzerland can often act more independently. For assets, this means lower political risk for investors. Gold in Switzerland is not only physically secure, but also less politically exposed.
That is precisely why many international investors have been relying on this for decades. Zurich. We see this very clearly in the demand for gold savings.
That's quite interesting because in the question, excuse me, I have to briefly intervene. There was the sentence, if things really seem unsettled in Europe, it should be taken into account that things are already unsettled with current European politics. I already mentioned it earlier with all the excessive subsidies and so on. And of course, as we've already heard, Switzerland doesn't even participate in such wars or conflicts. It simply doesn't get involved. And that's why it's just as important. That's also why it's a strategic location on the one hand for us. And that's what we recommend to our clients. At the end of the day, and security matters, and Switzerland stands for security. It's as simple as that.
For 600 years.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It has always separated itself from Europe and their strategies and tactics, and has always done its own thing. That's why we often get questions or similar questions about Switzerland and its independence. So thank you very much for the answers from the three experts. Let's continue. I would like to transfer precious metals from a safe deposit box to your high security vault in Frankfurt. Can I be sure with Baronware that when I withdraw them, I will get back the exact same pieces I deposited? That's a perfect question for Mr. Trinker. Yes.
Of course, and thank you for the question. That's a good question. In fact, all the items you bring in are listed precisely in the storage contract. Of course, everything is first tested for authenticity. That's our standard procedure. That always has to be done. And then everything is listed exactly in the storage contract. So you have, for example, 50 grams of Perth Mint gold, 3 bars, and that's recorded exactly like that. That's very important for traceability, for insurance, for inventory checks, daily inspections, regular audits, for everything. It's listed precisely. It's clearly noted which bars you have stored, and you will receive exactly the same bars back, the same ones. Bars always have serial numbers, but those are, of course, not recorded. You have to keep in mind that in such a high security vault, there can easily be 10,000 pieces of a single bar or product stored. And if you then insist on a specific number and say you want number 123 XYZ, someone would have to spend hours searching through all 10,000 bars for that number. That wouldn't make any sense at all, since all the bars are worth the same. And they're the same size and come from the same manufacturer. That means if you give us a 10-gram bird mint bar to store, you'll get back a 10-gram bird mint bar as well, but not necessarily the same one with the number you originally gave us. And you can also sell or pick up that same 10-gram bird mint bar at any time. Or of course, you can also buy another one, and you have the ideal flexibility. Everything that is recorded in the storage contract is, in addition to daily inspections, also physically counted twice a year by an independent auditor. If you want to know exactly, you can also request an individual report if you wish. Serial numbers, of course, are not recorded. And I think we've pretty much framed and covered the question well. And feel free to stop by and take the right step.
All right, that's all about the GVS storage. Let's continue with our viewers' burning questions. Will gold rise in 2026 only because of politics, or is there more to it, Mr. Dragodiewicz?
Yes, very good question. There's always more to it. I have already shared quite a bit of some very exclusive insider information with you today, which are the specific types of complex details that I deal with on a regular daily basis. That means it's not just politics. Of course, politics is a trigger, but not the core issue. The core, of course, is debt, money supply, growth, the exponential increase of money, and of course, loss of trust. Politics accelerates this process. And of course, in some countries, it happens faster. In others, it happens more slowly or at a steady, stable level, like in Switzerland, for example. On the other hand, if I take Germany as an example, things might move a bit faster there. And historically, gold has always risen when real interest rates were low or negative. That's exactly what we're seeing now in 2026, for example. Gold doesn't react to individual politicians, but to systemic developments. And that's often misunderstood. And it's often said, for example, because of what so-and-so said, the price went up or down. Yes, that's often a misunderstanding. It's a general issue, or rather a bundle of several issues, I'd say. Great.
What else do we have? We have a question about bonded warehouses. I read that it's advantageous if the provider of a bonded warehouse offers what's called an all-risk insurance. Do you have something like that in Singapore or Switzerland, Mr. Trinker?
Thank you for the question. Interesting question. And yes, of course, our warehouses in Singapore and Zurich are also insured with all risk coverage. All risk is actually a technical term from the insurance industry. And more precisely, this term means that it is insured against all risks except those that are excluded. So it's actually a simple definition. Everything is insured except for the items listed there that are excluded. And from experience, we know that in these high security warehouses, nothing ever happens. That's why everything works very well with all risk coverage. Everything is insured except for the explicit, that is, the expressly stated exclusions. So what are these explicit exclusions? That's where the good Lord usually comes into play. That's called force majeure or acts of God, as they say in America. Let me give you a few examples. Yes, radioactivity, terrorism, civil war, and things like that, but none of that would destroy your gold anyway. So it is extremely well insured with comprehensive all-risk coverage. And I can, of course, certainly confirm all of those specific details for you right now.
Yes, all GVS warehouses also insured with all risk. Next question about prices. And should I still get in this year or in 2026, or have I already missed most of it anyway? Mr. Draguljevic.
Definitely get in. So don't wait, as I've already explained. And Christian said it too, and Carlo also said it. Don't wait, get in. I can remember we've had this question in a similar form in the last webinars. Back then, we also said, get in. And this time we're saying, get in as well. The crucial question isn't whether you're too late, but whether the fundamental problems have now been solved or are being solved. And that's clearly not the case. Money is still available in unlimited amounts and will continue to be created without limit in the future. There are still banking crises, real estate problems, and structural debts remain unresolved. So as long as that's the case, the environment for tangible assets like gold and silver is fundamentally always intact. And what we've seen so far, from a long-term perspective, was more the beginning than the end. That's why this question can be answered very simply. Get started. And of course, any entry point makes sense. That means don't wait. We are here for you. Call us or send us an email. Order through our web shop. Every entry point is worthwhile.
Exactly. As if the good Lord had just heard Mr. Draguljevic, we're already setting a new record in gold again. We have now reached €4.13, or are scratching at $5,200. So while Mr. Nikola Draguljevic is still speaking, you can place an order in our web shop. Or if you find it a bit difficult at first, just call the gold hotline listed below. Our colleagues are happy to walk you through it the first time. Next question, storage. We're playing a bit of ping pong between prices and storage. Mr. Trinker, should you keep gold at home in a safe, or is it better to store it somewhere abroad? What is truly secure?
Well, that's the classic question. It comes up again and again, and it's always a good one because it concerns everyone. Once you have gold, that's really the next issue you need to solve. Then everything else is basically taken care of. So simply put, at home you have control over it, but you also bear the greatest risk. Risks like burglary, fire, robbery, someone holds a gun to your head, or rather to your wife's head. They say, I'll pull the trigger if you don't open it, or something along those lines. So in that situation, you'll definitely open the safe. So even the strongest safe won't help you in that situation. Therefore, if you have the choice, it's better to store it abroad. But of course, not just anywhere abroad, but in a high security vault operated by a gold provider, for example. And when people think of storing it abroad, many believe it's so complicated, but it's really not. Your gold is held in your name, it's LBMA certified, regularly audited, and you can sell or have it delivered at any time. In fact, you needn't handle anything abroad yourself. Usually, no need to contact Switzerland directly. Maybe you might, since they also speak nicely there. German? Carlo has already introduced himself nicely, but overall, you can handle everything with us, whether in Vienna or Germany. You don't need a bank account to store your gold. And the banks also have no access to your storage. And of course, we don't share any data either. So it really doesn't get any more confidential than this. So you have the highest level of security and you have the greatest flexibility. And some customers might do it this way. They combine things, keeping a few small pieces physically at home, often individual items that just don't fit into collective storage. And the larger portion is stored professionally. And especially when it comes to larger amounts, that absolutely makes sense. A small note, perhaps also for better understanding, especially for many new customers or people who haven't bought from us very often. When we talk about consulting, there is no sales pressure. I also want to mention this, especially when it comes to storage.
And I will switch back right now over to the team in the studio.
Does storage in Switzerland have any tax disadvantages? Are you aware of anything in that regard, Mr. Del Prete?
Very important, no. For Austrian and German customers, gold remains exempt from capital gains tax after 1 year, no matter where it is stored. Many people forget that. It's not about tax tricks, but about security. And that's exactly what we comment on openly. Switzerland itself does not have a capital gains tax on precious metals, but it does have an annual wealth tax that must be paid, about 0.12% for residents of Switzerland. All right, that's all about Switzerland and storage. What else do we have? Here, quite interesting. Is it just me, or is financial control getting stricter every year? I could say quite a bit about that as well. Yes, it is getting stricter. Yes, the control is increasing in all areas, including ours. We are also constantly being audited here in all possible directions. Perhaps Mr. Dragoljevic can add a few more details on that. Thank you for the question, definitely. Yes, I agree with you. The controls are getting stricter, but you have to take into account that when a system gets out of control, you have to find a way to bring it back in line and plan for certain mechanisms. By that, I mean the uncontrolled expansion of our paper currencies. That's why governments have to plan some countermeasures as well. But on the other hand, of course, there may be more reporting requirements, less cash, less leeway, etc. And of course, this doesn't happen out of malice, but rather due to the state's need for control, as I just mentioned. But for the individual, it's very important to prepare in advance to make purchases in time. Here in Austria, we still have a cash limit. We are, in fact, one of the only countries in the EU with this. We still have the 10,000 euros cash limit. Of course, that's a huge advantage and very attractive. Gold is, of course, one of the few assets that doesn't constantly generate data. That's also important. That means on a gold bar or the classic gold bar that people know, there is no QR code or anything else that could be scanned. At this point, things are getting even more interesting, especially in the precious metals industry. There are more and more of these, so to speak. Even precious metals, that is, bars produced with a QR code, which can also be tracked, where the origin of the bar is, etc. This way you can see exactly the origin of your bar and everything related to it. So this is also going to be quite interesting in the precious metals sector, including for us in purchasing to see how everything develops. But as I said, traceability is always being put in the foreground, self-protection and so on. And that's something that really needs to be emphasized. Self-protection is always the main focus. And
great. Next question goes straight to you. How much gold and silver does GVS have? This has already been touched on here and there in the presentations, but now let's get specific.
Yes, thank you very much for this very good question. Dear viewers, you will now get a detailed insight into our GPS system, the gold supply system. Of course, over the past few days, I've also been on the phone with our colleagues at the branches asking what's going on there. Everyone is, of course, reporting queues and an overwhelming number of customers. I would say it's quite impressive to see this, especially from a branch overview perspective. Right now, and it's important to emphasize that not a single customer went home without precious metals. So everyone received gold and silver from us in the city, just as they wanted. And the crucial point with GPS with us is with us in purchasing, in procurement. Of course, as I explained earlier, we are not at the end of the supply chain, but right at the very beginning. This essentially means that with our partners, we are one of the most significant clients with long-standing partnerships and, in a way, also one of the largest international networks in this global industry. And that is, of course, a big advantage for us because it means we have long-term supply contracts and can position ourselves early, plan ahead, and so on. That means we don't only start planning when shortages occur or when demand suddenly experiences a dramatic surge and skyrockets, or rather exactly at the moment when demand rises. That is precisely when we are fully prepared, strategically positioned, and ready to meet that demand. Whether this is achieved through our specialized duty-free storage facilities with our colleagues or generally across our various global locations. That means at this particular point in time, GVS still has plenty of resources. Precious metals, in other words, unlimited. And of course, we certainly notice that as well. In our daily business operations, as I have said before, every single customer or even our major corporate clients always leave here with a very satisfied smile. And I just checked the current prices myself, and I really have to say I left with an even bigger smile than before, even today, at the end of the day, because silver too, I believe it has risen by about 7% in US dollar terms. And that means since the beginning of the year, we've seen a silver price increase of over 50%.
All right, thanks also for the update at the very end. Let's continue and head back to Switzerland for a bit. How does it actually work when I buy gold in Switzerland through GVS? Many people think it's some kind of magic, but I think it's actually quite simple, Mr. Del Prete, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. A lot of customers ask us that because they think it's complicated, but it's not. With us, you get personal advice and we clarify the amount involved and the possible storage location. You can also purchase it directly for storage, the structure. In Switzerland, anonymous over-the-counter transactions are possible up to 15,000 francs per person in calendar year. Beyond that, if the amount is higher, a form comes into play which asks whether the money is yours and whether you hold any political office where you could exert influence. It's really not rocket science. After that, you can buy physical gold up to an equivalent value of 100,000. For amounts over 100,000, there's another form. That one is just about where the money comes from, but even that is easy to define. As I said, all these documents remain locked away with us. They don't go out. We have client confidentiality. From what we hear, we keep being told how uncomplicated the whole process is.
Great, thank you for clarifying and guaranteeing that it's actually quite simple. Even in Switzerland, it's possible at any time. I believe the opening hours were from Wednesday to Friday, if I'm not mistaken. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, then my colleague is right. Great. You can come by anytime. And on Saturdays as well. Exactly, Saturdays too. That's especially important for those who are busy during the week. Next question. Officially, they say inflation is under control. But why don't I feel that at all? Mr. Trinker?
Because it's quite simple. It's not under control. But officially, whoever is behind officially, which is usually the government, politicians, the country's leaders, they obviously don't want us all to know how high inflation really is. That's obvious because otherwise we would be very unsettled, since inflation is actually a creeping redistribution of burdens. In reality, inflation is much higher than what is published. I don't even need to prove that to you now. You know it yourself. Just look at electricity prices, housing prices. The official numbers don't capture that. Those are just averages. But our everyday lives measure the reality. Some people have rents that are skyrocketing, insurance premiums, groceries. That's another big topic. I've said it again and again, and I've also talked with Mark Friedrich. By the way, a really great interview. I can recommend it to everyone. You can find it on YouTube on our channel. And Mark and I both firmly believe that food prices should actually get cheaper at some point. It just can't be that food gets more expensive year after year. There must be some experience to draw on so that things can be done better, faster, and cheaper. But no, that's not how it works. Inflation is a very important part of the financial system. It simply doesn't work any other way. It all has to do with interest and the whole business, all the way to exponential money creation. So no, inflation is much higher than what we're being told, and it's going to keep rising. Taxes are rarely lowered. That's another thing to consider. Now we have this so-called sham package here where for some food items, taxes, the value-added tax are being significantly reduced. But whether that's really going to be a big deal, well, that's up for debate. But overall, not much is going to change. In real terms, we're all losing purchasing power. In real terms, if you haven't secured your wealth in gold and silver, you're losing the value of your assets. And gold, in contrast, doesn't just protect against today's or tomorrow's prices. As protection, it's actually a long-term safeguard against the gradual loss over many years. And that's why our clients hold on to gold, and not just in the short term, but strategically and for the long run. Only if you really need it to live, that's when you sell it. And that's where denomination comes into play. Make sure you don't have denominations. I don't have denominations. A few years ago, they weren't even worth that much money. And now they're already over 1,000. So keep in mind that this will continue, yes. So denominations are becoming more and more important, and gold is the best protection against inflation. And of course, after 1 year, it's also tax-free. Where else do you get that, right? Gold should be at the center of your life.
Yes, that's how it is.
Yes.
But just to add to that,
well, I just wanted to say maybe I digressed a bit, because you could say officially inflation is under control. Yes or no, but it's all connected because what we're being told about the inflation rate is just a puppet show. Now, all of a sudden, it's 3.4%.
Right. And besides, you can't just go out and talk to the public and say it's all just nonsense and everything is bad, because then you'd basically be undermining trust in your own product and so on. So there are a lot of factors at play here altogether. And I think the phrase, "this is part of the financial system," really sums it up. That just hits the nail on the head, and everyone else can fill in the rest for themselves.
By the way, Christian mentioned earlier, for example, there are always packages or support programs for society, like reducing the value-added tax on food products. I believe in Austria, a reform law was just passed. In July 2026, it will be reduced to 5% instead of 10%. If you do the math, that's about 7 cents saved on a carton of milk. But on the other hand, no one talks about the fact that, for example, a plastic tax is being introduced for companies. So that's actually also interesting. And it's 2 or 3 times as high. Now, just take a moment to really look at exactly how much single-use plastic packaging is actually being consumed every single day.
And I predict that in the end, if you calculate honestly, this whole action will cost more than it saves. And how can it be that apples are included, but bananas aren't? Just because bananas don't grow here. I mean, honestly, that's the kind of thing that makes you shake your head. And as a drinker, I notice beer isn't included either. Outrageous.
But milk?
Yeah, milk. I mean, I was thinking about, but what the heck was that? I'm not really sure. Yeah.
I think we could go on about this for a long time, but Mr. Trinker put it well. There's a great expert video with Mr. Mark Friedrich and Mr. Trinker where exactly these social issues are discussed, the ones that actually affect and shape all of our daily lives. Yes, exactly. And yes, you can find it in our web shop, in the media library. Just click in. It's very current, very red hot and brand new. Yes, I have to.
Sorry for interrupting. Just one more word, because Mark is such a great person. He really has such a deep understanding. He gets everything we're talking about. He understands it. And he's been preaching this for years. He's written many books about it and is truly an asset. So I can recommend him to everyone. But check out the interview. It's really fascinating.
Definitely worth mentioning. Next question. What does the decoupling of the physical silver market and the paper market mean? Are we already seeing that, Mr. Dragoliewicz?
Yes, it's actually quite simple. A brief explanation. The paper market trades promises of silver. This is just a promise, as I mentioned earlier. In most cases, you don't actually receive the physical silver. The physical market trades real metal. That's exactly right. So Goldvorsorge trades on the physical market. We trade real assets, real metal. And that's exactly what you get from us. No paper or speculative assets. And here, for decades, this wasn't really an issue because there was trust. But the paper market is many times larger than the actual available physical quantity. That's something you have to take into account as well. That means on paper, there are 376, I think, as of today, I checked, 376 times more silver on paper than is physically available at all, meaning 376 users would have to compete for a single physical unit, so to speak. And here's the point. If more and more market participants want the physical silver and not just an entry in the books or something similar, then of course tension arises in the system, and that's exactly what we're seeing more and more these days. That means people out there are realizing that paper is no longer the real thing, but the real thing is, and so they're naturally converting all that paper into physical form, taking it out. Not everyone gets it. Unfortunately, most of the time, maybe just cash or some kind of promises. And that's only if anything at all. That's also an important point. Maybe there will be some rule changes or something else. But it's also important to note that delivery times are getting longer and longer, especially with these kinds of issues. When that's the case, of course, the premiums go up, certain denominations become hard to find and so on. So if that's not strictly regulated. And those are the classic signs of a gradual decoupling between the paper and the physical asset. But the system hasn't broken down yet. Paper is still being traded. But you can already see a slow, gradual disappearance of paper, or rather the trust. And that's why when it comes to gold provision, we place great importance on ensuring that you receive real material, physical, genuine, precious metal at any time. And you always have access to it with us. And in the end, that's all that really matters, not just a promise on paper. And that's actually the reality behind it.
Really interesting. Thank you for your assessment. Let's stay with silver and move on to a viewer question. How much silver should every household own to be prepared for future developments, Mr. Trinker?
That is a truly excellent and insightful question. And I also find it absolutely remarkable and impressive how much silver has risen in value. Now, silver is finally the preferred choice for investors everywhere, because for such an incredibly extensive period of time, silver was. But now, at last, silver is where it always should have been. And of course, you should also have a bit of silver in your household. And customers naturally ask about this as well. And to be completely direct and honest, this isn't about speculation. It's about being prepared. That's the most important thing when it comes to gold and silver. Dear friends, the most important thing is to actually do it. Just talking about it doesn't help. You have to actually do it at least once. And then there are the other questions which can also be derived from this and resolved, such as whether you should keep it at home. Silver, compared to gold, has a practical advantage anyway. It's more divisible because the prices are still lower. It's more affordable and easier to use in everyday life. If necessary, it can also be used for bartering and so on. And our customers say quite openly, I want something tangible for emergencies. And even if those few ounces you have at home might never actually be used to buy anything, and you might have to do something else and so on, still, even just having the feeling that you already own something is already worth it. Because there is no perfect amount, but having a basic stock makes sense in every household. Do it step by step, keep buying a few coins at a time. Once you actually reach the point of having master boxes, then you should use a high security storage facility. A master box is 500 ounces of silver. At that point, you've worked hard and saved diligently. You don't need that much at home. At that point, it actually becomes more of a security risk. And it's better kept in a high security storage facility. But please, number one, do it. Do it. Keep a small portion at home and the larger part professionally stored, ideally in a bonded warehouse. That way, you save on value-added tax. At Goldversorger, we are always happy to explain this to you. It's transparent. In every consultation, there is never any sales pressure. And we always buy everything back at any time. Silver is not an immediate substitute. For money, rather, it is a supplement. It's like money, it's a supplement. And today you prepare yourself with silver, with gold. You make provisions so that you have something later on. And that is the real precaution. And that's why you should do it. And if you have any more questions about the topic, please contact us. We look forward to being able to advise you in detail.
All right, that's all about silver for now. Maybe let's add one more silver question to wrap things up. According to the control room, we have 3 more to go. What else do we have? How should one deal with the high volatility and possible price fluctuations in silver? Mr. Dragoljevich?
Yes, that's also a very good viewer question. We've had some very good questions today, I must say. Thank you very much for that at this point. Yes, so the price of silver, or prices in general, they go up and down from time to time, as we are seeing now. But basically, the time aspect is always the most important factor. If you want to hold precious metals for the long term, you don't have to do anything about short-term price fluctuations or even take them into account. You buy, observe, stay calm, and over time you benefit from the price increases. If, on the other hand, you want to act in the short term, it's about, of course, using price peaks to sell and buying again when prices drop. But most of the time, that's a bit like playing roulette, a bit of a gamble at that point. That's why it's called short-term speculation. But here again, the time aspect is key. For the vast majority, let's say 90% or even 99% of our customers, they always prioritize security and wealth preservation, meaning they invest for the long term, especially with us in the duty-free warehouse. We have many regular customers, long-term clients. They don't even pay attention to the short-term price fluctuations anymore,
or they just follow it out of curiosity, and then they're happy about the next price increases like we've seen in the past few days. And that's really the key point. That means if we invest for the long term, then invest right away, buy more, and then sit back and relax and maybe even plan your next vacation. And then exactly that means real security. Maybe even to Switzerland, because with Merndell Prete, you also have the beautiful Swiss mountains in the background. Absolutely, there are quite a few options for us at GVS. Either cold with the Swiss mountains, a bit of natural idle, or really hot in Dubai with the spectacular tall buildings, or Singapore, which is similar. So there are quite a few options. You can always reach out to Mr. Trinker and he'll be happy to advise you. He's just waiting for your call. Next question. Will Goldversorge require a digital ID as a prerequisite for conducting business? Mr. Trinker.
Yes, thank you very much for this question from one of our favorite clients, if I may say so. I love all my clients, and this one is especially dear, a truly wonderful client. If I may say so, he is currently traveling in South America and has been for quite some time. And that was his question. And I can assure him, first of all, with certainty and confidence, that we at Goldwarsor currently have absolutely no intention or plans to implement a digital ID, to integrate it into our systems. But we all know that the future is digital. Whether there will still be analog oases where one can perhaps retreat, I would be in favor of that. But overall, the systems, which are already more or less almost entirely digital, will become even more digital. So at present, we at Goldwarsor have absolutely no plans for this. Not because we're too lazy, but because we simply don't want to take part in this right now. There's just nothing to it yet. Of course, you can speculate a lot and wonder what all could come of it. Naturally, it could become a good system. But like any good system, it can also be abused. But it's here, the digital age. If you need a driver's license or a passport, you can only get it now with this digital ID anyway. How things will proceed with private companies is currently just speculation. Sooner or later, and you might laugh now, but it's really not that far-fetched, this could happen as soon as this year, and we'll all be amazed and left speechless. Sooner or later, robots will be walking around and they'll look just like us. Then you might still be laughing, but that's really not so far off anymore. Then quantum computers will come into play as well. That's when things will really get exciting. At that point, you won't be able to escape technological development anymore. So it's a bit of a dystopian scenario, but please don't be afraid of it. In the end, things are never as bad as they seem. And Goldwarsor has no intention of pushing you in that direction. On the contrary, we are your shield and will remain so for as long as it is at all possible. Best regards. I believe you are currently in Chile. Great.
And the very last question we'll take with us this evening, it's about the end of the Fed as we approach the end of our webinar. What happens if the Fed is abolished and taken over by the government? Mr. Trinker?
Yes, that is quite mean. And now I have finally managed to get this one too. Well, to be honest, I'm actually really looking forward to it, because this is a fascinating topic that you can discuss in so many different and interesting directions. I actually have an absolutely unbelievable conspiracy theory about it. I don't know if I'll share it, but I'll just get started now. And you have to preface this whole question by saying that everything changes over time. And the Fed, the Federal Reserve, which is basically the central bank of the USA, is actually an established private association. My conspiracy theory would go into when, why, and how it was founded and what had to happen beforehand for it to be established. Maybe the word will slip out of my mouth and you'll all be amazed. But the Fed is also a privately established association. Among other things, it is responsible for the money supply, interest rate formation, and so on. A better and more comprehensive association could also, at some point in the future, potentially develop, which would ultimately replace the Fed, the Federal Reserve, with another different institution. It will probably be called the Trump Fed. They'll come up with something along those lines. But basically, these are the usual market economy concepts. One thing is replaced by another. There's no need to be stressed about it now, is there? And panic. Because if they actually do it, especially with the Americans, it's always very well prepared. And the new thing is usually even better.
For the government, of course, that's very clear. And the government takes over that part. Well, the government doesn't have to take it over because the Fed, or even the Fed's successor, will always work to the government's advantage anyway. And in the background, business is always going on anyway, or more precisely, financial business. And of course, when you hear that the usual currencies are getting weaker, it's the same with the Fed, yes. New systems are coming and even the Fed has an expiration date. What's interesting is when and how, but everything does. And even Bitcoin will have its expiration date. Now, Bitcoin is coming into play. Does the Fed also have an expiration date? And at some point, the Fed will also come to an end. Not with Bitcoin, of course. I wouldn't dare say that. But the Fed will also be over at some point. So Just to say this much, the Fed was founded at Christmas, I believe, in the same year after the sinking of the Titanic. And by all those who weren't on the Titanic, because otherwise they wouldn't have lived to see it, and all those who were against the founding of the Fed were invited on a trip on the Titanic. You can look that up for yourself. It's a really fascinating topic because all of them, of course, went down with the ship. So all opponents of a new Fed went down, and then the new Fed was founded at Christmas, I think in 1912 or 1913. Read it up for yourself. It is honestly quite a chilling and creepy story from the year 1913. Yes, I truly want to thank you very much for providing such a detailed assessment and the comprehensive forecast for us. It's about the end of the Fed. And with that, our webinar has also come to an end. I would like to thank our 3 guests for their great expertise, assessments, and information. There was also quite a bit of insider knowledge again. Thank you for that. Greetings also go out to Switzerland, to Mr. Prete. Thank you for participating and joining in. Dear viewers, I wish you all a pleasant evening. I still have a few things to announce for all our new viewers. We regularly host webinars. You can see Mr. Trinker and Mr. Draguljevic regularly. On average, we are live every 5 weeks. You can also secure a spot for the next webinar right away at webinar.goldversorge.com. Our team will display the registration page right after the webinar. Yes, please always register again, even on the day of the webinar, even if you don't necessarily have time on the day itself. We always record the session and send it to all participants after the webinar. Gladly by email, and this way, if it got too late for you, or if you missed half of it, or maybe even the entire webinar, you can always take another look, click back in, and browse by chapters. You can rewatch the scenes that interest you the most. Yes, also follow our social media channels. As I mentioned earlier, we currently have Mr. Trinker, especially together with Mr. Mark Friedrich. There are extremely valuable interviews, a wealth of information that should be taken into account. And there will be many, many more to come. So many crazy things are happening in the world. Our experts keep you up to date on all of it. And last but not least, we also have many customer inquiries ongoing. That means we're happy to receive your emails and your calls. We are always here for you Monday through Saturday at any time. Give us a call. I've noticed many new viewers in the chat who have lots and lots of questions. Please give us a call. Mr. Trinker, among others, and his colleagues are always ready for you and will answer any questions you may have. Until then, until the next webinar, I wish you a restful night. Mr. Billets, I just want to say something very briefly because I almost fell off my chair just now, but I've already recovered a bit. I got really dizzy. I just received a note from a colleague who reached out to ask for an update regarding the total number of storage contracts that we have successfully concluded up to this point in the month of January. And the month isn't even over yet. It's absolutely incredible. And for that reason, I want to take this opportunity to say very explicitly, once again, a heartfelt thank you to all our new customers announced here live. A heartfelt thank you. Thank you. You have chosen real security. You won't regret it. Thank you for placing your trust in us during these exciting times. I may feel a bit dizzy, but I'm happy about it. It's really great. The work is waiting for us even in the coming weeks. Of course, we're happy about that. And a warm welcome to all our many new customers as well. And we will continue to keep you informed. As I said, we'll continue in about 5 weeks. Until then, I wish you a restful and good night. Goodbye. Good night. Goodbye. Good night. Goodbye from Vienna.